4 minutes after 10, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It's not just quotes from the actual White House that have been left out of some coverage of this Chagos Island story, but quotes from the governor of the actual Falkland Islands apparently being omitted in favour of people from opaquely funded think tanks. What a tangled web we weave. Thankfully, there is a rather splendid lawyer in this country who you may have come across before. He's indefatigable. He is tireless. And if I tell you for how many years he has been working on this case, you probably won't believe me. You'd have to sort of chop his leg off and count the rings to work out how old he is and how likely it is that he could actually have spent the number of years that he claims on this case, which Colin in Portsmouth and others are being encouraged to get incredibly furious about, despite the fact that until yesterday they had never heard of the place. A beautiful example of how right-wing media can conspire with profoundly dishonest right-wing journalists to create or to encourage fury among people who understand almost nothing about the issue under discussion. So a little bit more on that. We will indeed be speaking to the lawyer who has spent 46 years on and off working on the case for the Chagosians, beginning when he was 21. But we're not going to start with that. Oh no, what are we going to start with? A bit of an odd one, this. We're going to talk about assisted dying later in the programme. And then in the final hour, I've got two contenders. We always do something a little bit different on Fridays. And it was National Poetry Day yesterday. So in the finest traditions of this programme, we're going to mark it 24 hours late. Or we're going to have a discussion about atheism and the fact that the balance of belief has now tipped towards atheism. And it occurred to me on the way down, so I was feeling even more pompous than usual, that atheism and poetry are quite obvious bedfellows, aren't they? Which poem do you think? I've got one in mind. If you pay far too much attention to this programme than you should, and I mean probably more because you like it than because you hate me. There are people who pay extraordinary amounts of attention to this programme because they hate me. And I don't just mean Keith. But if you pay quite a lot of attention to this programme because you like it, you probably know what poem I have in mind. There's a poem I have in mind that almost beautifully marries those two potential topics together. Poetry, which I've got a lovely question to ask you about if we decide to go that way, and atheism, because Britain is now entering its first atheist age as parents increasingly fail to pass on religious beliefs to their children. What poem, one of my all-time favourite poems, one of the sort of dozen or so poems that I can actually do, well, I can do it off by heart in my head or when I'm struggling to nod off, but if I then try to do it from memory publicly or on air, then quite often I stumble and get lost. But I have tried. So there is a beautiful, beautiful poem that almost perfectly marries together the two topics under consideration for our 12 o'clock conversation, poetry and atheism. But we're not going to talk about that yet either. I would just say quickly about the assisted dying story that this will be the first time I have addressed this territory. It can be a bit of a hardy perennial, the assisted dying debate, and it is heartbreakingly easy, for want of a better word, to find people who've had really harrowing personal experiences that inform their opinions. But I have to tell you, we will be talking about this, I think, for the first time since I watched a good friend die. It's not an experience I'd ever had before, and I realise as I prepare to come to that conversation, probably after 11 o'clock today, that it does inform you, and it makes me realise that perhaps we shouldn't let it. The decision of what a society does, what the law does, probably shouldn't be taken. Or we probably shouldn't answer that question based on very specific and individual experiences because they kind of cancel each other out. But we're not going to talk about that either. We're going to talk about Ozempic and indeed other jabs or other treatments that have kind of run away, haven't they? They've kind of swept the country in the most extraordinary fashion. I bumped into an old mate yesterday who I hadn't seen for about just under a year, about 9 to 10 months. Last Christmas, in fact, I gave you my heart. And the very next day, you gave it away. I spotted him, and for about 4 seconds, I thought, I know that bloke, but I don't know why. I know that chap, but I can't quite play. And then I realised it was my friend, my old friend, a friend of 22 university, 30 years, 32 years standing and sitting. A friend of 32 years standing who I had not seen for 9 months. And I clocked him, and I couldn't remember who it was. I couldn't quite place who it was. And then I realised there was a heck of a lot less of him than there usually is. He's one of those people who... David Cameron claimed that his nickname at school was Puff because his weight fluctuated so much. As someone who was expelled from public school for Puff, I can only marvel at the likelihood of that actually being true. But he was one of those people whose weight sort of gently grew. He never got massive, but by the time I saw him last Christmas, he was a big lad. He was, he carried it well and all of that, but he was clearly a big lad, and it clearly weighed upon his. Isn't it amazing with weight how differently it spreads out on different people? I find that extraordinary. You know the way in which some people, like body mass index is a guide to stuff. The way that some people will put all of their weight on their bottom half and next to nothing on their top half. I don't know whether this is more true for men or women, to be honest with you, but sometimes the fairness of it, the unfairness of it seems incredible. Some people can put on 3 stone and it's spread out so, what's the word I'm looking for? Evenly. It's spread out so he was one of those people. He wasn't someone that you bump into after 9 months and it looks like he's pregnant. His belly has just sort of shot out of the front of him at a million miles an hour. I'm cursed in this department with the old moobs. If I put some weight on, they go straight to the chesticle area, which is grossly unfair. And it's linked partly to posture. So Keith has taken on a new role this week on the programme. I can't remember whether we told you. Keith is now head of posture. And he's in charge of reminding me to throw my shoulders back a little bit more as these bloody cameras in the studio all the time, catching you in all sorts of strange. But so Keith's now in charge of posture. He got a 15% pay rise for that, to add posture to his list of responsibilities. So he occasionally says to me, sit up straight, which is, strangely distracting. It's like, I had a French teacher once who used to find me physically fascinating. Not like that, thank God. But he couldn't believe that I managed to sit in a chair in a way that defied all right angles. I used to sit so low down in a chair, I move the microphone. I used to sit so low down in a chair like this. I'd be almost like this. I'd be almost sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a sort of bowl. I was in a bowl shape in my chair. And obviously when I was as thin as a rake in my youth, this kind of posture is unproblematic. My French teacher hated it. Used to play rugby for England, would you believe, my French teacher. Spoke French in a broad Yorkshire accent. It was one of those teachers you look back on fondly, but at the time you were absolutely terrified of him. And that, of course, as you get older and a little bit bigger, the posture issue becomes absolutely crucial because it goes straight to the chesticle area. The more you bend over in a chair, the more the what would you call it? The more the exaggeration of the chesticle area is acute. So recumbent's a great word, Steve. You can go to the top of the vocabulary tree this morning. Yes, when I was recumbent. So I saw this lad yesterday, and it took me a while to realise that he'd lost a ton. It took me a while to realise who he was because he'd lost a ton of weight. And he was very open about it. He said, it's this miracle drug, Jim. It's this, I've been on the old Ozempic, he said. And he's also, as a consequence of losing weight, he started playing paddle tennis. I'm giving you all the details here. Poor fella had no idea he was going to end up as a major feature on the most popular talk show on British commercial radio on a Friday morning after sharing his health kit. He started playing paddle tennis, but he started playing paddle tennis after he started the jabs. I said, how do they work? And he said, well, I'm not very hungry. He said, he was never a great glutton, never a big boozer. I'm just not very hungry. And I said, well, that sounds bad. Because I quite like my food. He very kindly said you wouldn't actually be allowed it. You wouldn't be prescribed it. You'd need to put on some more weight. I thought, I can't do that. I'd be like Melinda Messenger. Or you'd have to put on some more weight before you'd be prescribed Ozempic. I did, in other news, see myself on the biggest cinema screen in Britain yesterday. My friends Anthony and Nicola Caulfield, who've made a wonderful film about the ZX Spectrum called The Rubber-Keyed Wonder, had its world premiere at the BFI IMAX down by Waterloo Station here in London yesterday. And that is an interesting experience. I'm not sure I'd advise it. If you are considering seeing yourself on the biggest cinema screen in the entire country, I'd probably caution against it or urge you to approach it with caution. But he talked to me about this drug, and he was quite evangelical, which means that my attention was caught this morning when I opened my newspaper and saw that health officials have announced plans. This is in the last 24 hours. NHS England has proposed that 1.6 million people are offered injections of Mounjaro, which sounds like something Vic Reeves used to say, doesn't it, when he was on Shooting Stars? Mufafu, Mounjaro. But it's not. It's the brand name of a drug. The one you may have heard more familiarly is Ozempic. This one is dubbed the King Kong of slimming jabs because of its powerful impact. It will be offered to the most obese people with the most health conditions. Over the next 3 years, they reckon they could probably get to about 250,000 people with a BMI of 40 or over and other health conditions that will be exacerbated and worsened by obesity, by weight. And ultimately, about 1.6 million people will get the jabs over 12 years. On the NHS, my friend, I have to tell you, went privately. And I don't know what to make of it. I really don't. It's a bit futuristic for me. It's almost a bit Hunger Games, if you pardon the pun, isn't it? It's a little bit dystopian. You sit there eating ice cream for the last 20 years thinking, oh, don't worry, the boffins will come up with something. You know that you should probably be taking a Lime bike to work, as I am wont to do these days. Or you should be eating less red meat, or you should be watching your calorie intake, steering away from the ultra-processed foods. You know all of these things. We're having a little on-screen argument now about which dystopian fiction is most brought to mind by weight loss drugs, and I must cede to the producer, Eleanor. You're absolutely right. It's more Aldous Huxley. It's much more Brave New World than it is Hunger Games. But you sort of sit there thinking, I don't need to take personal responsibility for anything because here come the drugs. Here come the scientists. They're going to do it. On a very, very personal level, the idea of not enjoying my food, it's one of life's great pleasures, isn't it? I made a French onion soup the other day that frankly should be in the Louvre. It was so delicious. There should have been some way to save it for posterity. I'll tell you my secret if you're very, very good. It's all about the beef stock. So I don't know. Listen, it's Friday. It's been a tough old week. The news is awful, almost everywhere. This is interesting. This is something that could affect, if not you, then someone you love. It's a story that could quite easily park itself in the middle of all of our lives in various ways. It's very fresh in my memory because I should tell you, my mate looked fantastic. You know, some people lose a lot of weight and they look worse than they did when they had it, and you sort of think, well, I'd put it back on again if I were you, mate. You look weird. He looked great. He looked absolutely... He looked like he looked 20 years ago. But it's cheating, right? And if he stops taking the drugs, we'll do his habits. So the first question I've got for you is the obvious one. What's it like? 0345 6060 973. People should now have been doing it for long enough. It should have been around for long enough for us to get beyond chapter 1. So chapter 1 is, oh my days, this is a miracle. What's chapter 2? What's chapter 3? What's chapter 4? I could go on, but I won't. So the first flush of fascination for many of us is past, or for you perhaps is past. So what do we think about this? And I don't quite know that I've got the legs at the moment to go in on the philosophy of it, but there's something inside me that's troubled by the philosophical question of personal responsibility. Now, in conversations about obesity, I normally hate the personal response. Some people have problems with their bodies because of their minds. Eating disorders, we're always perfectly happy to accept the reality of when people are not eating or when people are incredibly thin. But we are a little bit skeptical historically of eating disorders in the context of people who are obese, people who are not very thin. And it shouldn't be like that. So I am aware of the dangers of even bringing personal responsibility into this conversation. But looking at my mate, he did not have an eating disorder. And I can't currently see, it's all silver lining and no cloud at the moment, except for this niggling fear that I've got of a kind of dystopian future where we don't actually have to do anything because there's a pill for it. Or a robot, I suppose. Should we get stuck into this morning? Do you fancy it? Well, bad luck if you don't, because that's what we're talking about on 0345 6060 973. 22 minutes after 10 is the time. So there it is. 1.6 million people potentially being offered this sort of King Kong of weight loss jabs. Goodness knows how many people have already tried, either under the auspices of the NHS or, in the case of the people I know, going privately. What do we think of it all? Is it possibly just a miracle drug? I don't know why, but Clive is very keen that I remind you or tell you that it is a drug used in the treatment of diabetes. It's not. I think that's how it was discovered. Actually, the weight loss was a sort of happy coincidence almost. It reduces the amount of glucose or sugar that's produced by the liver and slows down how quickly food is digested, helping to lower blood sugar levels. I didn't say it was only for obesity, Clive, but if you want me to clarify that, then, mate, it's your show as much as mine, and I am more than happy to do so. So consider it clarified. 22 after 10. Let's start with Adam, who's in Bedford. Adam, what can you tell us?
Good morning, James. Long-time listener, incredibly nervous.
Well, it's only man. It's Friday. I never fight with anyone on Fridays. Go on, Adam. What do you want to say?
So, I mean, as many callers say, I've wanted to call in before, but this one, you literally spoke right to me.
Wow.
So if you go by the BMI scale, I've been obese, or technically obese, since I was about 18.
Yes.
I'm one of those people that doesn't look it, but I have been. And
yeah.
So my entire life, I've just been complacent about it, as you do. And I've got very good friends that run their own gyms. So I've had many times trying to work out. They've stuck with me. So my nutrition's been good. I've done all the programs under the sun. But, life happens. I suffer from anxiety and depression. And that kicked off about 10 years ago. So I'm 40 now. And the weight really kicked in was when I had my first, because, everyone that's had kids, works manic.
The body clock gets thrown out of kilter. You eat when you can.
Exactly.
You're hoovering up bits and bobs and snacks and comfort eating and all the rest of it. Absolutely right.
Exactly. And then 10 years later, the heaviest I've ever been.
Right.
Blood pressure medication, fatty liver. A year ago, I got diagnosed with an enlarged spleen. And I was like, something has to change. So I went down the NHS route first.
Right.
They tried Orlistat, and that was okay. A little bit hairy for anyone that's had it. Will understand what I mean by that. But that started messing with my other medication a bit. So I was like, I went back and asked for a referral to the obesity clinic, and we cited my comorbidity issues, and eventually, after about 9 months, got first appointment, which I thought, great, we're going to start it and we're going to talk about the injectables, because I looked up private gastric surgery, and I know some people that have had it, and
so do I. It's quite mixed results, actually.
Yeah.
One person I'm very fond of had a terrible time with gastric surgery. Go on.
And I also, coincidentally, work in the life sciences industry, so I kind of understand the science behind it and how the industry works. And the idea of this, because it's essentially the jab targets your hormones, right? Yeah. It monitors the hormones, which helps level the playing field. And so, long story short, I went through the NHS process. I'm still technically in the NHS process, but the only option they give you, so that first phone call after 9 months was, this is just a welcome call to let you know about what the next steps in the process are.
Right.
In about 6 months' time, you'll be invited to an appointment where you have your first meeting with the doctor, and they go through your food plan, your nutrition plan, so everything that every other program out there does as basic, right?
It's a clicky line, so I'm going to have to nudge you towards starting the injections and what's happened.
Yeah, sorry, James.
It's not your fault.
Yeah, so anyway. So I knew that wasn't the direction that was going to get me the results I needed as quick as I needed. So I went privately, started on the Mounjaro. I'm in my 3rd month.
Mounjaro.
And
I can't do that every time someone says Mounjaro, can I? I can't go Mounjaro, but I might do. Anyway, so 3 months ago, what happened? Tell me quickly.
So I started taking the jabs, and the best way I could describe it is it's anti-anxiety medication for food.
Wow.
The noise goes. I was not over-ordering, so I used to get massive anxiety like, I've got to get sides or I've got to get a big one.
Yeah.
And now I don't. And you saying you enjoy your food?
Yeah.
It's giving me the freedom to actually enjoy my food. So
to enjoy what you have instead of having fear of missing out or of not getting the right thing or I should have got some garlic bread or I'm not. This is what I'm having. This is all I want and I'm going to enjoy it.
Exactly.
Any downsides? Any downsides?
The first week was quite some strong side effects, but I worked through that. And
for example, bearing in mind people might be having their 11s early.
Yeah, nausea, bloating, and that was a day of feeling rough, and then they got through it. But it does vary. But the one last thing I want to add, James, is it's not a miracle. It deals with the food, deals with the noise, but I'm still, seeing a personal trainer.
Yeah.
Still listening to my body. You have to listen to the body and what it's doing, telling you not to eat, as opposed to old habits.
Yeah, and that was very much of a piece with what my friend was saying. And how much weight have you lost?
I'm down about 10 kilos now, and another 50 to go.
Well, good luck, man.
Cheers, bud.
Hang in there as well. Seriously, 10:27 is the time. Just on a very self-referential note. A few things delight me more than when someone like Adam says, you were talking literally to me today. And some topics, there'll be loads and loads of people that we're talking directly to. Other topics, there won't be. It's not good or bad or right or wrong, but that's remarkable, isn't it, when you turn your radio on and it's as if someone's literally talking about you. David's in Birmingham. David, what would you like to say? What can you tell us?
Hi, Jim. How's it going, mate?
Yeah, all good.
Again, this is another one. I just want to echo was it Clyde that was just on?
No, Clive was the one complaining about me not bringing diabetes into the conversation.
Yeah.
Go on.
So the last lad that was on, absolutely my experience. I am diabetic. I have been since 1999.
Right.
Always been a big lad. Always struggled with my weight. Peaked probably around about the time of the 2019 election. I was probably around about 20 stone.
Okay.
And managed to get that, the diabetes was getting worse and worse.
Yes.
I was put onto something called Victoza, which was kind of one of the earlier drugs.
Okay. By your GP?
Helped. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, GP and hospital, yeah. So, and that helped, but it became unavailable, and I had 6 months where I couldn't get anything. And I'd lost a lot of weight. I gave up drinking 2 years ago, and I'd gone down from over 120 kilos to around about 100. So I'd done pretty well, but it had plateaued, and my blood sugars were going worse and worse and worse. And then in June of this year, so I've only been on it for, 3 and a bit months.
What have you been on?
Mounjaro. Yeah, or as I call it, gyro. I take it on a Wednesday, and I call it in my blood sugar diary gyro day.
Oh, crikey! And how's it going?
Brilliant.
Is it? No.
My sugars have come normal.
Yes.
Absolutely normal. I've gone down from about 100 kilos to this morning I was 92.
Well done, mate.
So I've lost another, getting on for stone.
Tell me what that feels like. What does it feel like when you see the numbers ticking down?
Oh, it's brilliant. It's transformational. I've come off my blood pressure meds, but it like your last caller said, it's not just about, it's about portion size rather than anything else.
Okay.
I still love my food. Uh-huh. I am a bit of a foodie. Just been in France for a couple of weeks and thoroughly enjoyed myself. But it's
even while on the gyro, so you could say, "Well, that's really good to hear." That's really good to hear.
The food doesn't taste bad. You just desire less of it.
Okay, you feel happy quicker. Sated. You feel sated quicker.
Well, you feel, that's it. What happens is because it affects your... It's about your hormones, and it's about how quickly and how efficiently, those tell you that you're full, I guess, is the easiest way of saying it. But it's not a panacea. You still have to do the exercise. I still do, I've taken up running. I cycle, I'll go out and do, 25 to 50 miles, on a bike ride.
So why do they go hand in hand?
I started running, and I started.
Why is that?
20,000 steps a day.
All right, stop showing off. Psychologically, why is that the case? Because that's three people now. The first two callers are my mate yesterday, who have made the lifestyle changes that they didn't make until they were on the drug. So what was it? Because you can see the progress being made more.
I was already doing that level of exercise, but I've got the kind of body and metabolism. I've got, it's called metabolic syndrome, really, because it's not just around one thing. I've got, I've got the diabetes. I've got the body shape that puts on weight in the wrong places.
Yeah.
I've got, a fatty liver. I've got all these other things that are wrong with me. And so it's a combination of things. It's like whenever you go, whenever you see people with type 2 diabetes and they're on insulin, they're not just on insulin, they're on a whole range of things. And one of those is diet and exercise. You still have to put in. Which
is why for the NHS it's a no-brainer the way you're talking about it.
It's an absolute no-brainer. Prevention is better than cure.
Isn't it? And I suppose the type 2 diabetes is next on the list of things that you might actually be able to...
Well, I'm hoping. I mean, it's coming down. I still take insulin.
Tom Watson did that, didn't he?
This is the thing. I've come down. I was bearing in mind my sugars were out of control, and I've come down from taking, I think it was...
Mate, I'm late for the news. I'm sorry. I mean, I've got to go to the news, David. Go on, in a sentence.
I've more than halved the amount of insulin that I take, so hopefully that'll keep going.
I mean, so NHS, everything works. People are healthier. Money is saved. It's all sounding perhaps a bit too good to be true, is it? Or not? Maybe it is. Thank you, David. It's 10:33. Amelia Cox has your headlines. 10:36 is the time. Why don't you have any women on? Says some angry poet. Well, I can only speak to people that ring me, for heaven's sake. Helen is in Long Itchington. Is that enough woman for you, angry texter? Let's find out. Sorry, Helen. What an introduction. What a great name of a village. Is it a little village, Long Itchington?
Oh, yeah, it's an amazing village in Warwickshire. Yeah, it's beautiful. I've only been here a couple of years. Yeah, it's lush. Hi,
what, you have, or the village has?
Oh, the village has been here far longer than me.
I was going to say, it sounds medieval. Right, what can you tell me about Manjaro?
Yeah, Manjaro. So I've been shouting from the rooftops about Manjaro since March. I've been on it privately since the end of March.
Yes.
I did lots of research because obviously it's been out in America for a while.
Okay.
And everybody talks about, Ozempic and Wegovy, which is semaglutide, but Manjaro is tirzepatide, so it works on two receptors.
Okay.
So for a woman my age, 53, menopausal, genetically wise, always been on the bigger scale, not massive, but definitely bigger, always struggled. It's been a game changer. So basically from the end of March until now, I've lost 60 pounds.
Crikey.
In weight, yeah. So just over 4 stone, which is incredible. It's an absolute game changer. It levels your hormones. So for women who are my age in their 50s, menopausal, it levels that hormone range. It also deals with the insulin level. So I'm not diabetic, never have been, but it kind of releases your insulin levels at the correct pace. So I heard some guys talking about it turns off all food noise, and that might sound like it doesn't make sense, but it's not until you have got the medication in your system
that you understand what he means when he says that.
Yeah, no food noise literally means, I might sit there and think, oh, okay, it's lunchtime, I kind of need to eat, but your brain goes, meh, not bothered.
Yeah.
So you got to be careful, because I would say that you could go far too long and not eat. That's not okay. That's not going to help you.
Yes.
So it's all about then, right, well then what do I want? And the mad thing is about this medication, it doesn't drive you to go to the, what you could say in inverted commas, might be bad food.
Right.
You're also geared towards, right, I'm going to have salmon, I'm going to have chicken,
Why?
which I eat anyway.
How does it do that?
Well, again, there's loads of research that's come out recently that's talking about the fact that it almost changes your brain chemistry.
Well, blimey.
Yeah. It's amazing. And also, James,
I need some negatives. I need people to ring in and tell me that it's made the hair fall out or the foot drop off.
Okay. So with any medication you take, there could be side effects. So the research that's gone on in America, it talks about some people have suffered with a little bit of hair loss. Some people have had terrible nausea. Personally, for me, I've also been very careful about titrating up when it comes to dosage.
Right.
So I don't know how much you know about Manjaro, but you start on 2.5 Manjaro.
Sorry.
I know, it's amazing.
I've got to stop
I won't tell you what my partner calls it.
No, you better not.
It starts on 2.5 milligram, which is classed as a loading dose, starter dose. Now, I've been on it 6 months, and I actually haven't gone above 5 milligram.
Okay.
So you've got to listen to your body, and you do what works for you. You know,
so it's going to be,
politically
speaking, it's going to be a fascinating experiment because it's going to involve short-term investment for massive long-term gain, isn't it? Because the more help people get on the NHS, the more access and help, but also the support you're describing, the amount of money it's going to save moving forward is inconceivable. But it's going to need the people there. In the first place, it's no good the first caller having to wait 9 months to get his first call back from
and it's funny because I've spoken to a lot of people, whether it's locally friends. I mean, I've got 20-odd work colleagues who are on it. So,
really?
As well as family members, So the thing with the NHS currently is that what I'm finding, and I'm on lots of Facebook groups about Manjaro, etc. And what you find is that the doctors currently, and not their fault, I guess, is that they don't know. Until now, because when I heard this announcement, I was thrilled. The doctors don't know enough about it. So when you go and they put you on their clinic list or whatever, they're like, oh, we don't know much about that. So if you want to go and do it privately, do it. Now they're getting with the program a little bit more. And the fact that there's no point putting people on, well, let's talk to a nutritionist, let's do this, because actually, fundamentally, it comes down to hormones, genetics. It's not about shame and blaming
people. It's
people.
about recognising that the biological and chemical relationship with food is different for every single organism.
100%.
Even if you belong to, especially if you belong to the same species. You know, the people who think eat less and exercise more, it works for them. But there's people who eat exactly the same as what they eat and exercise more than what they do, and they don't have the same biological reaction to it.
Exactly. It's the same. We've always said it. I mean, you know, my entire life, you know, I've been around people who are in inverted commas naturally skinny. You know, naturally slim, and they might eat exactly the same as me. But they're slimmer, they're half my size. And it's not that I'm sat on the sofa filling my face, because that's not who I am.
And that's such a lazy portrayal, which unfortunately is something else we can lay at the feet of lazy tabloid journalism over the last 20 or 30 years. And I speak as someone who was guilty of it once. 2 quick questions. First one is, you're doing the other stuff as well, like my other callers? You're taking changes in your lifestyle alongside the drug, are you, or not? Or perhaps you didn't need to.
Well, to be honest, you know what, so genetically for me, I've always been a fuller figured girl, lady, whatever you want to call it. And I've been quite happy with that. But obviously it gets to a point when for me personally, in my 50s, when you're then, you know, you're dealing with the menopause, etc., where the weight kind of clings even more. Now, as I mentioned, I live in a beautiful village. We've got 6 pubs here. I'm with me and my partner like to go out and socialise, whatever. So, you know, when you go out and you have a meal, you end up eating maybe something you shouldn't, whatever. I personally, for me, you know, a year ago, I was like, right, okay, something needs to change. And I've always struggled, so what can I do? I did some research. I paid privately through an online pharmacy.
And this is working for you. And what is the outlay? What's the cost?
So I'm actually really lucky. So I don't know if I'm allowed to mention who I use.
But you better not, just because I don't know. No. I don't know for sure. But just give me the figure.
They're an online pharmacy. They tell your doctor as well. I currently only pay $149.99
a month
for my pen.
And do you need a prescription? Does the GP have to tell the chemist that they can do this?
So the online pharmacy have got a clinical team, so that FDA, it's all FDA approved. And as soon as I'd ordered it through this pharmacy, I went onto my NHS app, and they had already informed my doctor. It's on my records.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's
So
all there
all
then.
above
I can't
board,
remember a
it's all-
phone in
yeah.
like this. I can't. What time is it? 10:44. I've got a guest next. I might not have time for someone. Maybe there aren't any.
Well, I do apologise.
No, not you. I mean me. It's like normally, even if I take 5 calls saying fantastic, 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 there'll be one just bubbling away in the background going, oh no, this is terrible. My head.
No, it's not terrible. It is an absolute game changer.
But all right. I think you'll take this in. It's a bit like one of those films, this, at the moment.
Is it?
Well, everyone's really excited about it. And then somewhere in Short Itchington, just a few miles down the road from you in Long, it's somewhere in Short Itchington, the first signs of the alien life forms that you've all been injected into your body is just coming to the surface. The whole world is excited, and we're all injecting it. And then, just in Little Itchington, there's an alien just emerging from Sigourney Weaver's belly button. It sounds a bit like that because I'm so unused to having undiluted, uninterrupted enthusiasm. Helen, thank you, and good luck with it. Crikey, it's 10:45. 10:48 is the time. We'll have 2 political guests on this week, 2 politicians who are guests, both from the Conservative Party. I just mentioned that in order to highlight how important it is to remember the existence of Tories who aren't mad or nasty or both. It was Dominic Grieve earlier this week, but I don't know if Saeed Owasi can be described in that terms anymore because, of course, she's left the Conservative Party this week, but she's joining us at 11:45 to, among other things, tell us why. Before that, Andrew Marr last night had Jonathan Powell, or Pole, I always forget which way. There's various members of that clan, and they all pronounce the name slightly differently. But Jonathan Powell on the programme, who helped to negotiate, certainly to instigate negotiations between the United Kingdom and the Chagos Islands, about which I'll just give you a quick rundown on what's happening at the moment in the British media. Liz Truss is blaming the fact that the islands have been essentially ceded to Mauritius on Boris Johnson. Tom Tugendhat is trying to blame it on James Cleverly. There was a right-wing think tank on earlier trying to claim that it was going to jeopardise the future of the Falklands, but the governor of the Falklands has come out and described her comfort with the decision and the differences between the 2 situations. At least 2 right-wing newspapers, and no doubt various other client journalists, are claiming it's some sort of surrender by Keir Starmer, or that the Prime Minister has defied the US to cede Chagos, but they both managed to fail to mention that Joe Biden has released a statement from the White House describing it as a clear demonstration that through diplomacy and partnership, countries can overcome long-standing historical challenges to reach peaceful and mutually beneficial outcomes. This agreement affirms Mauritian sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago while granting the United Kingdom the authority to exercise the sovereign rights of Mauritius with respect to Diego Garcia. So the White House are applauding the historic agreement, which you could be forgiven for not knowing if you're following some client journalism coverage of the story this morning. And, well, I think that's enough of the circular firing squad, isn't it? But I saw a tweet last night by a lawyer, an international human rights expert, no less, called Mark Stevens. I'm not saying that Mark has been around for a long time, but I think the very, very first time I stepped into a radio studio, which was at BBC Radio 5 Live about, I dread to think how many years ago, I think that Mark was actually in that studio. And that's not the only example in front of us today of his longevity, because he also tweeted last night that he first started working on this case, or the case of the Chagosian people. How many years ago was it, Mark Stevens?
46 years ago.
Well, you must be a pretty rubbish lawyer then. It's taken bloody ages.
Yes. Well, that's one interpretation of it. Of course, when you have one of the most appalling colonial crimes of taking a population and forcibly removing them from their homes on the Chagos Islands. There are 16 of them, which are basically the peaks of a a mountain range which is submerged in the southern Indian Ocean. They were then forcibly left on Seychelles and Mauritius and here in the UK, very few of them, and essentially became an underclass and ignored, which perhaps was due to the legacy of the fact that they were originally African Indian slaves who had been parked on the island because that was the easiest place to dispose of them out of sight. And so the Chagossians have always been, if you like, the third and ignored leg of this, and they've become important because of that massive US base on Diego Garcia.
Right. And when you first had your attention drawn to this 46 years ago, what essentially was the mission that you were charged with, or the cause that you sought to defend?
Well, between 67 and 73, they were forced out. So within the lifetime of many of the listeners, I imagine.
Yes.
And in 1982, the UK government decided to pay £4 million to a trust fund for the Mauritians. And that sort of sparked the problems at the time. And I was working for a brilliant, one of the original human rights lawyers, a guy called Cyril Glasser at Sheridan's, and he had a great moral compass and realized this wrong that was being done. And he had started the case here representing the Chagossians. And essentially what has happened is that you've had all the great powers, the US, the British, the French, and the Mauritians as well, arguing over who owns it. And back in 2019, the International Court ruled that when Britain was trying to make Mauritius independent, it artificially separated the Chagos Islands from Mauritius.
Okay.
Historically, they'd always been treated as one unit. And the British invented something called the British Indian Ocean Archipelago. And that was found in international law not to be proper, and also that they shouldn't have ceded independence as well. So this is effectively correcting that wrong.
So something else missing entirely from a lot of the hysterical coverage that I've been exposed to this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we've, as you said, the circular firing squad in the Conservative Party is actually a nonsense. So it was originally Liz Truss who decided that the 2019 opinion of international law should be followed. James Cleverly effectively concluded the negotiations using the good offices of Jonathan Powell to ensure that all this was done. And essentially, the Labour Party have continued and essentially enacted the arrangements that were already agreed in outline before the Conservatives left government. And there's been a lot of nonsense spoken. So the fact Tom Tugendhat has said that, it's, possible the Chinese will have a base. Well, that's dealt with in the arrangements. And the fact that Joe Biden is happy with the arrangements and he doesn't think that there's going to be a Chinese base next door to Diego Garcia perhaps demonstrates the nonsense and politicking which is going on at the moment.
More on that in a moment. We'll hear what Jonathan Powell himself had to say about it to Andrew Marr last night. But there is one fly in the ointment, and I thank you for drawing my attention to this. And this is essentially what we might call the indigenous inhabitants of the islands, the Chagossians themselves, who feel that they've been excluded from this entire process. In their case, perhaps one politician has not disgraced himself so far in this issue. Peter Lamb, the new Labour MP for Crawley, where several thousand of this community live, has been speaking up for them. That's a bit of a fly in the ointment of the whole shebang, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you would expect if you were about to have your British citizenship taken away, because that's what Chagossians are, they're British. It's a British colony, or has been, and you were suddenly going to become Mauritian, that you might have a say in that. And that hasn't happened, and I see why the Chagossians feel badly about it. And of course, the arrangements for compensation are being dealt with between the states and not involving the Chagossians. And it's far from clear that the Mauritians have the best interests of the Chagossians at heart, because they've always seen them as outsiders. They've always seen them as a poor underclass living in Mauritius, and as a consequence of that, they again have been ignored. I would say I think this is a positive step in terms of allowing Chagossians to go back. I mean, it's an amazing place. There are 16 islands, 15 if you discount Diego Garcia, and that's about 120 miles from the nearest other island. So you can imagine a sort of South Indian Ocean, Maldives type situation where there's these beautiful crystal clear atolls which people could go and enjoy themselves at.
So, thank you, Mark. And finally, I'd just like to know what it was that first attracted a fresh-faced, bouncy young Mark Stevens to the place at the tender age of 21. What made it beep on your radar?
It was just being educated by some of the older people. Most of the lawyers who sort of initiated this are now dead.
Yeah.
There's been a new generation, my generation, if you will, that's inherited it. But I think we did think that the behaviour of the British government at the time was inappropriate. And I think we've seen, if you look on social media, the sort of awful colonial comments.
It is colonial. It's the only word that works.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you know, in international law, what we did when we gave Mauritius independence was we illegally tried to carve out the Chagos Islands. And international law says we didn't do it properly. So it's our fault.
And here we are. You can prove anything with facts. Mark Stevens, Thank you very much indeed. International human rights expert. And of course, I don't know about you. I don't know. Did you hear the caller from Chippenham yesterday who was talking about how woke means that you hate Britain? And no one can ever explain to me what that means. Here's a really good example. Insisting that Britain abides by international law is in the minds of these people. And they go right up to the shadow cabinet, of course. That's what's anti-British, insisting that we tell the truth about our history and abide by international law. Have a listen to Andrew Marr talking last night to Jonathan Powell, who, as Mark Stevens has just reminded us, was heavily involved in these negotiations from the very start.
And what do you say to those who suggest this is the beginning of, as it were, a handover of all the remaining British territories? The Falkland Islands might be next, people are saying.
I think that's completely wrong. The overseas territories that remain are all pretty sui generis. They're all very, very different from each other and very different from this. I don't think this really sets any precedents for those overseas territories. Falklands, for example, is a question of self-determination. You have to persuade the people there if you want to make any change, just like we did in Northern Ireland. So I think that people who are suggesting this is an analogy or precedent are wrong, and our lawyers are very clear there is no precedent from this.
It's almost as if the people that brought you Brexit, Liz Truss, austerity, and I don't necessarily mean the politicians, I also mean the so-called journalists who cheered all of these things to the rafters, exercised years tickling the tummy of Boris Johnson and in some cases continue to do so, people that were comfortable with risk. It's almost as if the people in my profession who were cheering all of those things and now, of course, pretend that none of it ever happened, are still not telling you the truth about interesting and relatively complicated international issues, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, it's gone 11. That was a lovely conversation about weight loss drugs. It was curiously upbeat. I have to concede the next conversation will be altogether more serious. It is 4 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I think for the first time since I had the extraordinary experience of watching a close friend die a long and slow death, we return our attention to the question of assisted dying. And I've always found myself uncertain on this. I as a younger man, I was certain about everything. I don't know whether you have found yourself getting less certain as you get older or getting more certain. I think the temptation to get more certain is something to be furiously resisted. I really do, because otherwise, knit together the two stories that we've been discussing this morning. Otherwise, you end up believing the nonsense put out by completely inauthentic and dishonest commentators with regard this morning, for example, to the Chagos Islands. Some of the fury and certainty coming in on social media about about that issue is extraordinary, given that the people who actually know what they're talking about, whether it's Mark Stevens, our guest a moment ago, or Jonathan Powell, who was talking to Andrew Marr last night, is completely at odds with the picture being painted by bad actors in right-wing politics and right-wing media. But they speak, and the reason why they appeal more to older people than younger people, they speak to an ossification of opinion that increases, I think, or can increase if we're not careful as we get older. It's almost as if we lose the will to think about things. You know, I guess many of you will have a picture of Lee Anderson in your minds at this point when I use that phrase. We as we get older, we lose the will to think about things. I don't think that's fair on Lee, because I'm not sure he ever really had that will. But it's as if we've run out of energy to actually think about things, to actually worry about issues or get to the heart. And we just want to be handed a big lump of red meat that we can sink our dentures into and start growling furiously about whatever it is we've been told to get angry about by the people who are almost certainly much more responsible for whatever unhappinesses we have than the people that they are telling us to blame. And I don't know that there's a subject where I'm more conscious of uncertainty than on this one, because I have taken calls from people on this programme who have described circumstances which led me to be 100% in favour of assisted dying legislation. The idea of forcing people to endure horror and misery against their will, and to put their relatives in unbearable situations where they have to choose between potential criminality and watching someone they love suffer in unbearable fashion. I would put the phone down. I never put the phone down. That's not how the technology works. But metaphorically speaking, I would put the phone down on a call like that. And I've taken a lot over the years I've been doing this job. And I'd be certain that we needed to bring it back in again. And then the little worms of thought and thinking and the fear of certainty, you know, the danger of certainty would start nibbling away at my conviction, nibbling away at my certainty. And then I'd come across other things, like doctors pointing out that some of the attitudes to this may be informed by variables. I don't even mean medical variables. I mean treatment variables, by the fact that, for example, the what's the word I want? Palliative care in this country is not as good as it could be. So how many people whose experiences, and then of course the experience informs the opinion, are built upon the fact that palliative care in this country isn't as good as it could be. So the fact that people who are suffering unbearably could be better looked after is not taken into account when we address the question of assisted dying. I used to come at it religiously. I don't mean that as a figure of speech. I used to base quite a lot of my opinions on my Catholic upbringing. And that is another example of the ossification of opinion. Religion, sadly, for its many benefits, and we may get onto this in the next hour when we talk about the rise of atheism, for its many benefits, it does sometimes rob you of the freedom and ability to think deeply about issues. Something is wrong because your priest has told you that your God says so. Something is wrong because you have read in your favourite old book that it is wrong. So I used to get quite moralistic about this, about the sanctity of life. To give you an example of how dangerous that is, I used to also get quite moralistic about IVF treatment until we needed it, at which point all of my old arguments fell apart quicker than a cheap suit. And even, and you might not like me for this, but it's better to be honest than not, even abortion. As a Catholic schoolboy who was adopted, I went almost on a tour of schools defending the anti-abortion position, with what I thought at the time was the zinging argument that if abortion had existed in Ireland in 1972, then my biological mother would probably have terminated her pregnancy rather than feel compelled by her religious faith to come to Britain and give birth to me and happily and thankfully put me into the care of my mum and dad. So I was standing there at the age of 14, and Priggish doesn't even come close, suggesting that the main argument against a woman's right to choose would be that I wouldn't exist if a woman had the right to imagine a world without me, I could almost have said. So again, that came from my religion, with a little bit of personal experience, a little side order of personal experience. And then I lost a friend. Then I watched a friend die who had extraordinarily good palliative care. And I think it was Rachel Clark, who of course, whose book Your Life in My Hands was turned into that fantastic television drama. She's been a guest on Full Disclosure, and she remains a tireless campaigner on all matters NHS. We probably should have got her on the other day when we were talking about physician associates, but it was Rachel's comments this morning that really grabbed my attention. And her point was that the opinions of many of us may be informed by our experiences of palliative care, and that if palliative care was a lot better in this country, then some of our opinions would change. I love people who are honest about their lack of certainty. She wrote this morning, I think it's important to be honest about how conflicted I am about assisted dying. But I see patients who want to die now because they can't get decent or any palliative care. This is her world, by the way. This is her field. That is a national scandal. So people want to die now because they can't get palliative care. It won't be all people who are supportive of assisted dying, but it's got to be a huge part of it. Why are we talking about this? Because the House of Commons are to get a free vote on it. A historic vote. Labour MP Kim Ledbetter, who's also appeared on Full Disclosure, actually. It's getting ridiculous, isn't it? The roster of people that have appeared on my podcast. She's introduced a bill that will give terminally ill adults more choice and ensure stronger protection for their loved ones. But, and Rachel Clark, very clear about her confliction here, she reminds us that it could have a lot to do with poor palliative care. And that's even without mentioning some of the traditional issues regarding coercion or people feeling they're a burden, or people thinking that they will be better, their family will be better off with them gone, and not believing their family when they absolutely swear blind that they would rather have you here for another few hours, few days, few weeks, or few months, even if you're barely there in the traditional sense, than say goodbye to you sooner than they need to. And when I say when you're barely there in the traditional sense, I can see my friend on his deathbed. And we had no idea towards the end whether he knew we were there or not. Occasionally we might get a squeeze on the hand, or we'd see what we thought was a smile. And that was a brain tumour. If you're going to go down that road where people like him would be able to elect assisted dying, he was adamant before he became incapable of telling anyone. He was adamant that he didn't want to. He wanted to cling to every last drop. He wanted to suck the bottle dry of life, even when it was, to outsiders, to those of us who loved him, it was no kind of life. But he had extraordinarily good palliative care because he could afford to pay for it himself. And when I talk about him having no sort of life in the context of what we mean, I find myself thinking of dementia patients. What do we mean when we say it's no kind of life? If you don't recognise your own children, are we telling you, will society next? I don't normally like thin end of the wedge arguments, because that's what laws and regulations are for, to make sure that the wedge extends only so far as society has agreed that it will. But if it is physical, terminal illness today, does opening that door not make it more likely that it could be mental, non-terminal illness tomorrow? Or it could be quality of life-based decisions, not existence of life or end of life. So dementia, I don't know. And I am happy to admit to you that I don't know. But another thing I don't know, I sound like Donald Rumsfeld this morning. Another thing I don't know is whether the way I want to conduct this conversation will work. or indeed whether it is the right way to conduct this conversation this morning. Because I know that you could ring me now and tell me about your husband dying or your wife dying or your mum dying and persuade me in 30 seconds flat that they should have had the right to assisted dying. I know you could, all right? But that doesn't actually address the question of whether it's something our entire society needs or should have. Whether it's something that the entire society should have. And I'm very uncomfortable suggesting that the people I want to talk to are the people who haven't got much experience of hideous end-of-life experiences. Do you see why? It's the philosophers and the thinkers, it's the judges that make decisions like this in most civilized societies. It's not, you don't do it by plebiscite. And if you did do it by plebiscite, I mean, what would swing it? If you'd just watch your grandma die, you'd go through that lobby. If you hadn't, you wouldn't. And if you were worried that your grandma would choose to die when you didn't want her to, you'd go through the other lobby. And if you weren't, you wouldn't. So there's a reason why people directly associated with court cases have absolutely no say on the outcome of the court case. We might take a statement from them afterwards, a victim statement, for example, but we don't let them influence sentencing or verdict. We leave that to a jury. And if a jury was sitting on this, they would not be permitted to stay in the room if they had deep and profound personal experiences of the issue. Which is why I worry that so much of the conversation, so much of the discourse is directed by people who have heartbreaking stories to tell, stories that we've listened to often on this programme. So I could sit here now and say, I'm pretty sure that if I had really bad dementia and didn't recognise my children, I wouldn't want to live. But then I watch films, particularly I think in Scandinavia, of homes where they've embraced really visionary new ideas, and people might not recognise their own children, but their children recognise happiness when they see it, and those human beings are experiencing happiness. So would I be able to make that decision? So let's see, shall we? 0345 6060973 is the number you need. If you want to tell me why, I'm not going to apologise for using the word philosophically or the word ethically, because our civilizations are built on ethics and philosophy. It's why I reserve my greatest rage for public figures who ride roughshod over ethics that have been honed and shaped over hundreds of years, the rules of common decency, the reasons why we are not sort of hideous constantly to each other, why there are limits upon our behaviour, the politicians who break those rules, the politicians who ride roughshod over those conventions are the kind of politicians that paint targets on the backs of their own vice presidents. So that's why we need philosophers and judges and purveyors of ethics, examiners, scrutinizers of ethics, ethical codes. And I don't think we've got much room for religion here either, because it leads us to false certainty or unprovable. So you can tell me it's not false certainty. I know that God is opposed to this, but you don't. You believe he is. You might believe it more passionately than you believe that the sun's going to come up tomorrow, but it's still a belief. A philosopher would explain that just because the sun has come up every single day of your life doesn't mean it is going to come up tomorrow. That's epistemology, that is. So, what do you think and why? 0345 6060973. Because I'm just not sure. Make palliative care as brilliant as it could possibly be and then get back to me. That would be my position at the moment. Don't go down this road until palliative care is exemplary. If palliative care is exemplary, then the question changes. And if the question changes, contingent upon something we can change tomorrow, should we even be asking the question at all? It's 22 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A free vote for MPs. For the first time, I think. Lords have had it before, but not the Commons, on this question of assisted dying. Should it be legal in this country to help terminally ill people end their lives? And it's not always people who would be incapable of doing it themselves, but the logistics, if you like, of taking your own life can be harrowing. And the point about assisted dying and clinics like Dignitas is that they make everything, quotes, easier, end quotes. 22 minutes after 11 is the time. Mike's in Wigan. Mike, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Mike.
Hiya. I've just come out of the supermarket and caught the tail end of you talking about, where do we go with supporting people in dying?
Okay.
And I caught a bit about you talking about dementia. And I'll be honest, I've already spoken to my family and told them that should I get diagnosed with dementia, I won't be hanging around for the full-blown effects, and I will be taking my own life. Should that, scenario ever come to fruition.
So, I mean, that wouldn't be something that was affected by this legislation, would it?
Well, I don't know.
But I suppose it could be easier
in the
to
future?
do. I don't know.
Yeah, because, at the moment, I think my current plan would be to go somewhere nice and take a, cocktail of drugs on my own and end my life that way.
Yeah.
With no family around.
Yes, exactly that. And with no family around, because technically they could be accessories, where does it come from? The conviction, the certainty. I think you work with dementia patients, because a lot of the people who visit the dementia patients don't want the dementia patients to be dead, do they?
No, God, no.
And maybe your family wouldn't want you to be dead in the same circumstances.
But the people I work with, if they had the option a few years ago, before they'd reached the stages of having full-blown dementia, would they have wanted that option? Would they be wanting to go through what they're going through now?
We can never know, which is why we should err on the side of caution, surely, rather than
exactly. And I'm not saying that, I.
But you don't know what you would feel like. Do you cease? I know you sign over. What's the word? The legal term for when you sign attorney. You sign over power of attorney, but you don't cease to exist in terms of agency. You know that you're hungry. You know that you're cold. You know that you're warm. You know that you're happy. You know that you're sad.
You don't always know that you're hungry.
No, okay, hungry's a bad example. But on some level whether you want to be there or not, or no, you probably don't, do you, in some ways? I don't know enough.
When you get to full-blown advanced dementia, it's a horrendous disease. It is absolutely awful. And I don't want to be in a position where I'm not me. No,
I hear you, and it's a powerful contribution. But I mean, in the interest of the conversation that we're having, and the introduction that perhaps you didn't listen to, it's not a position that is relevant to the free vote that the House of Commons is coming to take, and it's not a condition that would fall under the remit at the moment of the free vote. The reason I mentioned dementia was because of my fears that it might extend to that, and that might become grounds upon which people could apply for assisted dying. It wouldn't trouble you, but it would trouble many others. And it also swerves completely the point about palliative care, which is a very simple point, which is some people who think today that they are in favour of assisted dying because of what they've watched and witnessed would not feel that way if what they had watched and witnessed had been better alleviated, been better cared for with palliative care. And that, I think, is probably impossible to argue with, but it doesn't change necessarily the final answer to the question of whether or not this is a road that society should go down. Thank you, Mike. Lisa is in Liss. What would you like to say? Hello.
How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
I was listening to Nick this morning, and I'm always very much like, I would definitely vote for this.
Yes.
And so would my other half. And looking at it from a personal view, I lost my dad. He was terminally ill, but it was through alcohol.
Right.
So I kind of feel like it's not as someone being given a diagnosis of cancer or something. But I would have definitely said that would have been the right thing for him, because we missed him. I missed him dying, which I'll never that's really, really difficult to think about.
Yes.
But with my nan, who's 96, with dementia, however, she has got sepsis and she's had a few skin cancer, where they've sort of not been able to operate because of her age, and we don't want her, being pulled about and everything. But she's, in the last few weeks, just really become a bit happier. And because of what you said today, I'm like, I don't know if I would support that now.
Yeah. Because
if you change the environment, that she had her hair cut and she just was and singing and they all had like this, that they had someone singing in the room and they were just having a lovely time. And I just thought, actually, I'm not sure if I do. It's not everyone with dementia. I mean, some of them, they can't necessarily walk.
I'm pretty clear that dementia would not fall into this, but my fear would be that it would do eventually. The middle ground, I suppose, the bridge between terminal illness and dementia would simply be, let's ask this question for society about assisted dying, when society has done absolutely everything it can to make people in this catchment as comfortable as possible, whether it's palliative care for the terminally ill or whether it's brilliant care for dementia patients. And in the absence of that, if I'm frightened of being in a building that smells of wee, or I'm frightened of being on the receiving end of some of the treatment that I've seen on undercover documentaries about care homes, or I'm frightened of being a burden on my family. If you can take away those fears, I think there'd be a lot of people whose answer might be different. And I worry that until you've taken away those fears, you shouldn't be asking the question.
Yeah, I definitely think so with dementia. And actually, like the care home, especially the so-called foreign people that work there, they're lovely. They sit there and hold their hands, and it's just until when you know, and you can't, and you don't know anything about a care home until you're thrown into that situation, or you work there, or
no, that's true.
But in terms of people actually at the point of dying, like my dad was on his own and he was in pain.
Right. And would he have chosen to?
Yeah, definitely, 100%. And we already were planning his funeral, but me and my sister had to go into the funeral homes, and so it was happening. It was real. And he knew he'd done it himself, but he was also really ill throughout his life.
Yeah, no.
And my stepdad, he was also really healthy and not an alcoholic, but he died in front of us, and he would have hated that. That was really undignified. He was gasping for air, and I just think if it's terms of that,
but this is the difficult bit. This is where you put me in an uncomfortable situation, because I need to remind you that these stories are really powerful, but they don't necessarily constitute grounds for an entire society changing its laws.
Yeah.
There's millions of things we wish could go differently in our lives, but whether or not that wish is enough to take an entire population and change potentially their lives is not clear to me yet. It really isn't. And I say this as someone who watched one of his best friends die during well, I didn't see as much of it as I would have done if we hadn't been during lockdown, but we were on the list of people that were allowed to visit, and it was a harrowing and life-changing experience. But it also, we're going to use this as a story to counter your story, Lisa, not to claim you're wrong or I'm wrong, or you're right or I'm right, but to watch someone whose life was reduced to the really bare minimum, but whose determination to cling on to every last drop, and our belief that he was capable of witnessing love right up until the end. Would you deny anyone love? So that's why it's not, for me, anywhere near as clear-cut as it sometimes can appear in a 500-word newspaper column. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. It's 11:34. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Saida Wassi joining us shortly to talk us through, partly why she has elected to leave the Conservative Party. I don't know if she was a cradle Conservative, but she was certainly a former chairman. But also one of the main reasons, of course, being this uptick in really hideous rhetoric and ideology. I think we can all be pretty clear about which community of people Kemi Badenoch was seeking to incite hatred against when she talked about a woman coming to the door and seeing Kemi Badenoch and saying, "Oh, I've got to go and get my husband." And Saida's new book, Muslims Don't Matter. It's self-explanatory title, really. We'll be talking to her after 11:45. Before that, the assisted dying and my attempts to make the conversation a little bit more nuanced and complex even perhaps than the radio phone-in medium traditionally allows. But I'm not sitting in judgment on anyone because I've taken calls over the years from people who have persuaded me by the end of that phone call that it is absolutely barbaric to insist that people see out their days in misery and against their own will. But we can't go into these questions. We can't go into this sort of territory glibly. There's also that, if you're going to be glib, there's the if it ain't broke, don't fix it, to which you respond by saying, well, it is broke. And I respond by saying, well, lots of things are broke. Things that have a bearing upon your answer to the question about assisted dying. If palliative care was better, if end-of-life care was better, if dementia care was better, would you feel the same way that you do now? And some people will answer no to that question, ultimately, whether they realise it or not, in which case, should we be asking the question becomes live. I always think of Henry Fraser when we're having this conversation. Henry's an incredible young man who somehow manages to create, frankly, breathtaking artwork, beautiful artwork, using only his mouth. He is a mouth artist. It was in 2009 that he ran into the sea and suffered the most extraordinary tragedy. And it robbed him of movement below the neck. And I read his story, and a West End play. His life was turned into a West End play. He's just a magnificent young man in a million different ways. And then I remember the stories of rugby players, a couple of rugby players who suffered almost identical injuries and went to the Dignitas clinic. So there's two different people in identical situations. You can't take one and use them as a reason why the other one shouldn't be able to do what they want to do. But the freedom to do, that's the thing about Lisa's call, about changing. I change my mind, particularly if it's not a mental, if it's not dementia. I think I want to die now. And then a year, you're not allowed to, and a year later you don't. Complex. David is in where? In Hertfordshire. David, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good morning. I've been involved through family, 2 assisted dying situations, both in Holland.
Okay.
One of them I was almost 100% in favour of, or believed that it was the right thing to do, and the other one is probably fair to say I was almost 100% against.
Oh my Lord!
And it's from having a position historically of thinking, yes, people should have the right to be able to do something. When you're actually involved in the situation and you start to think, well, where is this bar? Where is this line that it's okay to do it or not okay to do it?
Yeah.
And that's the conflict, I think, that you have, or the MPs will have, when they are making that vote. Because when you hear the horrendous stories, as we have this morning, and with Nick Ferrari, about people who are suffering interminably, then I see that is, and I believe that is something that should occur. And that was the situation with the first assisted dying. The second assisted dying, the person had a terminal illness, but he'd also just spent 3 weeks on holiday with me and family, and we all went back to Holland. And on the day of his, because you have to have 2 doctors and a judge sign it all off, and once you've got that signed off in Holland, you can make a decision at your leisure as to when you want to do something.
Yes.
And he chose he wanted to do something. And on the day that he did it, it was a beautiful sunny day. We were all sitting in the garden drinking rosé wine. And we know that the doctor is coming around at 5:30 to administer the drugs that's ultimately going to kill him.
Yeah.
And I found that incredibly difficult. And I said to him at the time, if this is not your time, please don't do it.
Right.
And he said, no, it is my time. It's my time. I couldn't get my head round the fact that the holiday previously, and the fact that we're sitting in his garden, that because he'd been signed off that he was of sound mind, and he did have a terminal illness, but it was legal for him, or it was legal for it to occur. And to this day, and partly, I suppose, I don't tell many people this story, and now here I am telling goodness knows how many people the story, because it has really conflicted with me. It really upset me, because with the first person, they had a chronic lung illness that was horrendous. The fear of going to the loo and not being able to breathe was he was just in a situation where it was time. Yeah. And this line of VAR, I'm not sure you're much of a football man, but where do you draw that line?
Right, I'm a Kidderminster Harriers fan. I don't think we've ever played a game that VAR has applied to, but I know of what you speak.
Yeah, if a toenail is over the line, then the person is offside. Where do we draw this line? Where do the MPs? Where do the medics?
Well, you can't. I mean, that's absolutely an articulation of where I am this morning, because you cannot give your first relative what they want without also giving it to your second relative. And you can't stop your second relative from getting what they think they want. And if I've understood you correctly, you think that with counselling or help or more time, he may not have ended up making the decision that he made. You can't prevent him from doing what he wanted to do without preventing your other relative from doing what he wanted to do, because at the moment, as things stand, they're both on the other side of the bar, aren't they? They're both on the other side of the line. And that's why it's a question for society. It's not, in many ways, you are the living embodiment of the conflict I was trying to describe in my introduction. You are somebody who recognises that you can't base it all on one experience, because another experience might come along that challenges what you thought you were certain about.
Absolutely. And as I say, I'm sitting here now talking to you and having the same conflict inside. And to this day, I can... I think I also want to put in this perception that, you slip off to Switzerland and you're sitting on the mountainside and it's bright, sunny and snow-capped heat and all that sort of business, or it's a lovely clinic. It doesn't actually... Well, it does work like that perhaps in Dignitas if you want to spend X thousands of pounds to go and do it. But when... I can talk about my experience of the Dutch, and in Holland. And the doctor arrives at the home, gives an injection to relax the client, then gives an injection to kill the client. And as many family members can be in the room, out the room, doesn't really matter. But for me, it was, and I'm sorry to use the term, for me, I viewed it almost like an execution. It was so cold, it was so clinical, it was, I'm not saying the doctor wasn't pleasant,
sure,
but it was, if I saw somebody who was about to throw themselves off the edge of a cliff, I would be pulling them back, regardless of what they told me, how bad their life was. I would be saying, please come back.
Do you see, because a few people are picking up on what they see as you overlooking your relative's choice, talking about how it's their choice, it's about them, not you. But I think I've read in between the lines of what you say, and what you're really saying is, I don't know that if I'd come back a week later, he still would have wanted to die.
I'm knowing the man as I did.
Yeah.
Okay. And he was a very logical person. And as far as he was concerned, the condition that he had equaled pain and unhappiness for him, and an eventual death that he did not want to go through. Yeah. And that eventual death that he did not want to go through was going to be painful and messy. And he didn't want that. Now,
so what was the difference then? Was it just time? I mean,
timescale.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's what I thought.
Do I believe that the man that stood and watched a football match with me, having half a beer, 2 or 3 evenings a week, 2 weeks before this event took place, was in a position that is being described by some of the callers that are calling in? No, that was position of number one.
Yeah.
Position number two was, I have the authority, because I'm making a personal choice and I have the right
and
to be able to
that's
do
why
so.
it's a question for society, because, you know, he has a terminal illness. It doesn't matter how many years he's got left. He has a terminal illness and he is of sound mind. I may as well get it over and done with now. And that, to me, sounds tragic.
Yes, and again, it's this bar. Where is this VAR line going to be when if the vote gets passed and then all the discussions and the law comes into position? You know, what about the poor soul who isn't quite up to that bar but is in a terrible state? I mean, as I said, I used to believe that people had the right. And
you might do again. You might do again. Seriously, it could swing back again with another personal experience, which is the whole point of this conversation.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you were able to contribute to it, albeit that I'm sorry that you were in such an extraordinary position to do so, David, because there it is. I don't, sometimes worry that I might have gone a bit bonkers when I'm trying to explain why some subjects are a little more nuanced than perhaps we allow. But you take one harrowing personal experience and it delivers certainty. Then you have another experience which is harrowing in a different way and it robs you of certainty. This is not a subject that should be lending itself to certainty. It really isn't. And so much of the coverage is built upon a place of certainty. Dare I say, there is no right and wrong answer to this question. And something about the human condition makes us really resent and resist that idea. There is no right or wrong answer to this question. So would you trust to make this decision for an entire population? It's 11:49. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. There was a remarkable moment earlier this week where I found myself quoting Margaret Thatcher in defence of the relationship that politicians should have with journalists. This after honest Bob Jenrick took the extraordinary step of singling me out for abuse on the stage of the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. On the subject of the Chagos Islands and some of the more hysterical right-wing responses to, not the facts, unfortunately, but to their deliberate ignorance or refusal to scrutinise the facts, here is what Margaret Thatcher had to say about international law. She said, "I uphold international law. Once we go away from that, we shall not know where we are. If we are not going to live by a system of international law, we are going to live by international anarchy. Then no people anywhere in the world are safe. You cannot be selective in your defence of law. You cannot say, I like that law, I will uphold that one, I will not uphold the other." And bear that in mind, not just on the Chagos Islands, but also, of course, on the European Convention of Human Rights. Appropriately enough, I have the second Conservative politician of the week on the programme, as well as the second quote from Margaret Thatcher. If you're just tuning in, you might think, who is this person and what's happened to James? But I'm not sure, Saeed Awasi, that I do describe you as a Conservative politician anymore, do I?
I'm still a member of the Conservative Party.
But you have made a decision to
relinquish my whip in the House of Lords.
Right, you are. So a member of the Conservative Party, but not of the parliamentary Conservative Party. What's the difference in your mind?
I felt that I needed to step away because there was an issue, a complaint made to the party, and the party wanted to deal with the matter behind closed doors. And I am somebody who fundamentally believes in accountability and open justice and transparency. And you can't believe in that stuff if you don't live by it. And I wanted to deal with this publicly. And I have great friends in the parliamentary party, including actually both the chief whips and the chairman. And I didn't want to make this difficult for them. I wanted to deal with this by stepping away from it for now.
It was, in fact, we've spoken to the young woman whose case that you spoke out in support of. It was the young woman with the placard depicting a couple of Tory MPs on one side of the placard as coconuts and on the other side of the placard depicting Suella Braverman as a sort of form of Cruella de Vil. But it spoke to a deeper dissatisfaction that you touch on in your new book, Muslims Don't Matter, and indeed a dissatisfaction or a distinction that I touched on with that quote from Margaret Thatcher, because as we discussed on Full Disclosure not long ago, the party you joined and the party that you're still in are very different beasts.
They are. And, my worry, certainly for the last 4, 5, 6 years, has been that increasingly we are no longer a Conservative party. and the kind of things that I fundamentally felt were instinctively conservative, the party of sound money, the party of law and order, the party of international accountability, the party of patriotism and healing, that none of those things were now being displayed either in the language or the policies or the behaviour of my colleagues. And so often people say to me, have you fallen out of love with the Conservative Party? And I would say, well, no, the Conservative Party has decided it's no longer a Conservative Party. And part of the challenge in looking at the conference over the last week has been, at what point is there going to be a realisation that we have moved so far away from core Conservative values, and at what point are we going to find our way back?
It doesn't seem to be on the horizon, does it? It doesn't seem likely to be popping up anytime soon, that realisation.
I think much will depend
Looking at the leadership battle.
Yeah, much will depend on who of the four get through. And I think certainly if maybe Tom or even James won, they have the potential and the capacity to move back.
To a place that you would recognise and feel comfortable in. Because one of the reasons you don't feel comfortable is because of the way that the party has addressed your faith, has addressed Muslim people, and that is where your new book, Muslims Don't Matter, comes in. I mean, flicking through it, because it's only, it's still wet, I think, the ink on this copy. You must have written this very quickly, because it encompasses the riots, the recent far-right riots.
It does. I mean, for me, there was a moment earlier on in this year, James, when I just felt like there were so many conversations that were happening with my family and friends, and so many of them were saying, we're thinking about buying somewhere else, we've bought somewhere else, we're planning to move the kids somewhere else, the whole kind of exit route plan Bs. And I had that conversation. I talk about it in the book. I had that conversation with my husband. We regularly go for walks. We were sat in a place not far from where we live, Nostell Priory, having a coffee. And I said to him, do you think we should be buying different kind of assets? Do we feel like we own too much capital? It's not liquid enough. And then I kind of half jokingly said, do you think we should buy some diamonds?
Gosh.
And I think, and then we just sat in silence for a while. And the enormity of the conversation that we were having hit me. And I thought, I need to write. I need to write and explain to people this sense of fear, this sense of heartbreak. I think it's what my kids would call journaling. I was journaling my heartache, and for 12 weeks just sat and wrote. And the week that I finished, the riots happened.
Good Lord.
And in many ways, when I was making the arguments...
The publisher straight on the phone saying, bad news, Saeed, you've got to get back in your study.
Yeah, well, I was straight on the news to my phone to the publisher to say, look, all the arguments I'm making in my book, this is it. This is what I've been warning of and predicting. And people thought that I was being, I was exaggerating. In fact, I think it was one of your colleagues, Ian Dale, who said, for a number of times I've said Saeed Abbas is really going over the top with this stuff. And then suddenly he's had to sit back and say, I absolutely get what she's talking about. Yeah. And I think that those summer riots was a moment
being
when...
able to admit that he was...
Yeah, and I think that was a moment when people stood back and thought, right, okay, this is what I'm talking about. So, yeah, it was written in 12 weeks. It's written in real time. It's 150 pages. And I hope it's the start, James, of an important conversation about where this country's going next.
But did you feel better when you finished it than you did when you started it?
I think I felt better because it was now on paper.
Yes.
And I think I feel hopeful because I feel it's a tool that I can now use to start the conversation. It's incredibly difficult to try and explain to people what it is that I'm talking about and what has happened over the last 10 to 20 years. So this does that in short form, in quick form. And I'm hoping that, once people, and already this is happening, there's events across the country that have been arranged where I'm saying to people, read the book and then come in and let's have the conversation. Ask me the toughest questions you want to ask. Nothing is off the table. As long as it's done in a way that's civilized and civilizing, and as long as it's done in a way with the intention of learning and making things better, let's start this conversation.
And how can people find out more about that? Where do they go?
So I think my publishers are mainly dealing with the events, but I will be putting them up on my socials as well.
We'll look out for that. What you're describing really is a depiction over 2 decades of Muslim people as an enemy within, as something to be feared, as something to be hated, and as the book reminds us, as something to be attacked. 3 grandfathers killed on the streets of England in 3 separate incidents by 3 different men, each targeted simply for being Muslim. There are still arguments even about whether the word Islamophobia should be in public discourse and what it might mean. But we know what you're talking about. You're talking about deliberate attempts to, for example, take terrible things done by someone who happens to identify as Muslim and pretend that that is what all Muslims would like to do, or that is what all Muslims are doing, to inflate stereotype and caricature in a way that other communities have become familiar with over the centuries, whether we're talking about Jewish people or Irish people or black people.
And it's deliberate,
yes,
James.
Of course it's deliberate.
It's stigmatising, it's demonising. This is why I said, look, it's easy to blame the angry young men on our streets who we saw committing violence and throwing things and bricks and burning things. But they were just the tip of the iceberg. You know, what led to that? Where was all the poisoning? And it's the powerful people in positions of authority that feed this. They make the policies, they use the political rhetoric, they put the newspaper articles out, they're on the front pages, and it's that demonising and distortion and disinformation over a period of time that eventually leads to this kind of violence. So, you know, people talk about, Islamophobia is all about shutting down debate. I'm saying to them, bring on the debate. I want to have this debate. I want to talk. Why is it that here we are in 2024, 70 years on from when my family came here, I'm still trying to argue for my rightful place in my own country?
It's 10 years on since you last resigned, on that occasion from David Cameron's government, over his conduct or support for events in the Middle East. So plus ça change.
Everything I said in that resignation letter, James, tragically came true. When I said that we have a policy, we have a great policy on the Middle East, actually, 2 states, 67 borders, East Jerusalem, capital of both countries, dismantling of settlements, return of refuge. We have a great policy. We do nothing to implement it. And everything that we're seeing across the world now, the wars in so many countries, the violence, the attacks, the killing, they are all the symptoms. The actual disease is occupation. And until we are brave enough to say there have to be 2 countries, occupation has to come to an end, and we have to have 2 states side by side, Israel and Palestine, we're going to see this.
Is it fanciful of me to see the two strands of the conversation we've just had in the same space? In a way, perceptions of Muslims, depictions of Muslims, informs some of the West's attitude to events in the Middle East?
I say that in the book.
I
basically say
doesn't mean it's not fanciful. We might both be daft.
Yeah. Well, the oldest Christian community in the lands where Christianity was born, Bethlehem, is been somehow wiped out. And when, for example, the former Home Secretary Suella Braverman talked about the pro-Palestinian marchers, she didn't talk about Christians. She talked about Islamists and extremists. She labelled them as Muslims. And the reason she did that is because the quickest way to dehumanize a group of people is to make them Muslim. So even when they are not Muslim on those marches, even if they are Christians, even if they are the oldest Christian community in the land, the minute they are perceived to be Muslim, they don't matter. And their lives don't matter.
And she knew exactly to whom she was appealing when she did that. Let me ask you about another prominent conservative who said recently, I think that cultures where women are told that they should not work, I would knock on doors and you would see somebody at the door who says, I can't speak to you, I will get my husband. This was in a conversation about cultures not being valid and wanting a country in which some people would not be welcome. Presumably this woman. Who do you think Kemi Badenoch was talking about when she said that?
I think we all know. And she did eventually let the mask slip and say that, she thought Muslim communities were not compatible in some ways. But, it just astonishes me. If you look across at Hollywood and the level of abuse women have suffered, if you look in Parliament and the level of abuse and sexual abuse and inappropriate behaviour and misogyny, if you look at the kind of language that I heard when I was a criminal defence lawyer that you would hear in police stations and in courtrooms, if you look at the fact that 2 women a day are killed at the hands of their partners in this country, if you look at the fact that abuse against women in this country is so rife that we have to have a specific policy and a minister to deal with violence against women and girls. If you look at the Sarah Everard case, I mean, it breaks my heart that a woman thinks that issues concerning women and the abuse of women are somehow linked to a culture or a religion or a part of the world. The abuse of women happens wherever vulnerability finds itself up against power, and it happens in all religions, all faiths, all societies. But what she was trying to do is exactly what I keep saying. Let's demonize, let's stigmatize, let's stereotype, let's play this nudge kind of behavior where we're trying to say that lot there are different to the rest of us and let's other them.
It was extraordinary on social media how many people who professed to be supportive of what Kemi Badenoch was saying in that context, and I agree that it's pretty clear who her target was, also turned out to be, when I looked at some of their accounts, admirers of Andrew Tate. So their attitudes on misogyny are somewhat mixed, to say the very least. And that brings us full circle because, of course, Nigel Farage cited Andrew Tate as a trusted news source for his contribution to the discourse that many people see as having contributed to the riots that you did manage to include in your new book, Muslims Don't Matter.
I did, and I think I find it astonishing how so many people who talk about misogyny within religion, or including Islam, which, by the way, I've spent my whole life fighting for women's rights within all sorts of spheres, including within conservative religious communities, find it very difficult to call out people like misogyny in chief Donald Trump when he openly talks about his misogyny and his treatment of women. So this kind of selective outrage where we get outraged at Muslim men when they're nasty to women, but we don't get outraged at white conservative men or, evangelical Christian men or, super conservative Jewish men or whoever it may happen to be, or Andrew Tate or celebrities or, people, right-wing politicians and their behaviour towards women. This is what I mean. Why is it? Islamophobia is when you hold the Muslim community to standards far higher than you would hold anybody else. And that's exactly what we saw in display, unfortunately, during some of the comments made during party conference.
Saeed Abbasi's new book, Muslims Don't Matter, is out now. Praise on the covers from David Baddiel, Riz Ahmed and David Olusoga, which gives you some indication of the quality of the text that you've submitted. Good luck with it.
Thank you.
It's 4 minutes after 12. It's 7 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I don't know that anyone got it. A couple of you got the right poet, but the contenders for this conversation were... There were two. The conversation we have in the final part of our week together, except for the podcast, of course. Oh, I tell you what, you want to hear me go full fanboy? My 16-year-old self has never been closer to the surface in an interview than it is in this week's episode of Full Disclosure. More on that a little later. But there were two stories that really caught my eye. The first was that the advent of the atheist age is upon us. For the first time ever, Britain is entering what they're calling an atheist age because parents are not passing on their religious beliefs to their children. This is a result of the largest study of its kind. I think we might get onto this next week. The reason we're not doing it today is partly because I think it possibly veers into territory quite similar to some of the territory we were exploring in the last hour. And the second story was to mark National Poetry Day yesterday, or it may have been a coincidence actually, but a survey by the National Literacy Trust found that children from poorer homes enjoy it more than their affluent classmates, enjoy poetry more than their affluent classmates. I don't know if the numbers are significant enough to really raise our eyebrows, but they're certainly significant enough for us to have a look at. 30% of pupils on free school meals said that they read poetry in their free time. The figure falls to 21% for classmates who are not on free school meals. 18% of children on free school meals wrote their own poetry, compared with 11% of children who don't. And there are other breakdowns alongside boys and girls. Now, I have asked you some mad questions over the years, haven't I? Do you know how Mystery Hour started? It was an actual phone-in. It wasn't a sort of throwaway comment. Goodness knows how the subject came up. I think, I'll tell you a secret, all right? There is a belief in some radio circles that this genre of radio should not be handcuffed to the news, that we should be able to sort of go off on relative tangents, or even to cover ourselves in conversation that has nothing to do with the news. Almost a tendency to ignore the news entirely and just come on air in the morning and start talking to you about whatever takes my fancy. And I do understand that impact. I think it's wrong. I think you need bedrocks, you need foundation stones of shared experience, and there aren't enough for 15 hours a week of conversation between you and me for me to come up with organically. I need little aid memoirs, and also I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by politics, but it was during this short-lived experiment in radio phone-in that had nothing to do with the news that I wonder how many people can remember this period of LBC's history. But during that, a couple of things from that era have survived. One of which actually is Mystery Hour, but I remember, for as long as I live, I'll remember this. We had a phone-in about why is gold valuable. It's not obvious. Why is gold valuable? Why is gold valuable? Why is gold valuable? Why not green? Why not a brooch of purest green? Blackadder fans, I'm not explaining it. Why is it valuable? It's shiny and rare. Pretty much it. Doesn't sound like much of a reason, does it, to imbue something with extraordinary... All right, shiny, rare and beautiful, potentially, and quite soft, so you can turn it into stuff. But why is it valuable? Entire economies built upon the value of gold. Gordon Brown still attacked by people who are a little bit hard of thinking for his decision to sell gold when the market was quite low. Gold, why is gold valuable? There it is. So I have over the years, that's an extreme example. What is the maddest question I've asked you in more recent years, do you think? I don't know. But we have occasionally, particularly for some reason after 12 noon on Fridays, we have occasionally veered into parts that no other radio phone-in has ever managed to reach. And of course, we always leave open the possibility that we're going to die on our backsides as well. And I am definitely, what's the word that I want? I'm definitely embracing that possibility today. Because the question I've really got in mind, there are two, obviously. One of them is going to involve the question of why would poetry have a deeper and greater appeal for poorer children than it does for their wealthier classmates? I don't know the answer to that question. It's a funny one, and I'm not really qualified to comment from any personal perspective either. I liked poetry more than a lot of my classmates, but I think in terms of income, we were probably roughly average, my family. There were some incredibly wealthy people at my school, but there were some people who weren't as comfortably off as us. I was probably below average, but this was at a public school, so it's not exactly tiny violin time, and I can't imagine that the survey would equate somebody in the lower half of wealth at a private school with children who are on free school meals. So I've got nothing on this. I'm entirely in your hands. But that's not the question that really fascinates me. And it's never really occurred to me before yesterday when I read this story. Are you ready? Don't laugh. I really want you to have a go at this, all right? How does poetry work? Why does that form of words affect us in such a different way from other forms of words? Most obviously prose. Why? Why does poetry work? Why does a poem have a different emotional heft from a paragraph of prose? How does poetry work? I told you this wasn't a traditional phone-in topic. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. How does poetry work? Rebecca suggests this was actually a rhetorical question. When I asked what's the most ridiculous question that I've asked you recently, Rebecca suggests it was, do you feel sorry for Jonathan Gullis? But I would argue that poetry possibly brings you closer to empathy than other art forms or other forms of words, and therefore the fact that I did manage to muster up some weird sympathy for Jonathan Gullis. Quite a few of you. Stephen has also picked up on this. Your weirdest question was, am I wrong for feeling sorry for Jonathan Gullis? Yes, you're wrong. Now give your head a wobble, says Stephen in Milton Keynes. And we do a quick Idiot's Corner. Here's Des. Why is O'Brien so obsessed with school, boarding school, public school? It's getting embarrassing now. Let me read it to you again, Des. Half of children are turned off by poetry, but pupils from poorer homes enjoy it more than affluent classmates. So this is a conversation, in the first instance, about children at schools. I can't make it any simpler for you, mate, than that. So, it's a bit like saying, why don't you phone up 5 Live and ask them why they're so obsessed with football on Saturday afternoons when they're talking about football? We are talking about schools. And inevitably, I draw upon my own experience of school, and on this occasion, acknowledge that I don't have any relevant experience at all. So I think you might be punching a little bit above your weight intellect-wise, tuning into this programme, mate. I could make some suggestions for other programmes, but I'm not sure you'd understand the complicated business of retuning your radio dial. But on we go, Idiot's Corner. Have we got the sound effect yet? Have we got the sound effect for Idiot's Corner? We're getting a sound effect for Idiot's Corner. Have we got it yet? No? Haven't got the sound. Okay, that's a shame, because Des is very deserving. He's very Des-irving. It's poetry, that. So why does it work? How does it work? Why does it affect us? What does it do? Why does it refresh the parts that other word forms and art forms cannot reach? 0345 6060 973. And then the question about the school children. Why would it be? This is children aged between 8 and 16. And it sees a notable difference in enthusiasm for poetry between the poorer children and the more affluent children. And it goes the way you might not expect, because we, in my view, tragically associate education with class. For example, when I read out Des's message a moment ago, you might have thought he was from a poor background. You might have thought that thickness somehow correlates with class. It doesn't. There are some incredibly thick people who are incredibly posh. Have a look at the Conservative Party, for example. So because, unfortunately, we labour under this illusion that education equals intelligence, we might have felt that the more middle class a child is, the more likely they are to enjoy poetry. I probably fell into that trap a bit myself, because I was surprised by this story. And I'm not wrong to be surprised by it, because if it wasn't surprising, it wouldn't be news, would it? This is, in a sense, man bites dog. Children that we might think would be less likely to be exposed to poetry are more engaged by it. So there are 2 questions for you here. One is, why does poetry work? What is it about poetry that affects you in ways that nothing else affects you? 0345 6060 973. I don't want to sound rude, but I'm not interested in hearing your poems. All right? Let me make that absolutely clear from the start. If you don't read me your poems, I won't read you mine. All right? That's the deal. And then the second question is, why do you think that children from less affluent backgrounds are more likely to engage with poetry than children from affluent backgrounds? If I could give a gift to you, it would be the gift of poetry, more than almost anything else. I mean, reading in general. But if I could turn you on to poetry in a way that you're not currently turned on, if I could make you feel what I feel when I've got a bit of William Blake bouncing around my brain, or when Philip Larkin is addressing the terrors of mortality or the difficulties of childhood, if I could bring you to where I get when when W.B. Yeats is talking to his former lover, who's old and tired and full of sleep and nodding by the fire. If I could give you that, I'd give it to you now. If all the things I could give you, if I could give you that, I would. But what would I be giving you? 0345 6060 973. It's 12:19. 21 minutes after 12. I guess we think of it wrongly as quite rarefied. We think of poetry in the same way that we think about classical music. We think of it as being posh. And of course it never used to be. Read a bit of Blake. Read Blake writing about chimney sweeps, or writing brilliantly about hypocrisy among the ruling classes. What's that line in London about the soldiers? Runs in blood down palace walls. The appeal to ordinary people, much more than the appeal to the upper echelons of society, used to be clear, as with classical music. But now we think of poetry as being quite posh. And yet it turns out that the children on free school meals engage with it more than the children not on free school meals. Those are my two questions. How does it work? Why does it hit us differently from other forms of words? And why would children from less affluent backgrounds engage with it more than their classmates, their better off classmates? 22 after 12. Nia is in Camberley. Nia, what would you like to say?
Hello, I'm first on call. I'm really nervous.
Well, don't be daft. It's only me. It's hardly a controversial. It's hardly a controversial topic, is it?
It's not a controversial topic, is it? I know a lot about this. So I'm a poet, and I'm also I'm a head of English at a secondary school.
Oh, fantastic!
And yeah, I'm just on my way to work, and I run a poetry club after school on a Friday for our secondary school students. It's a comprehensive. It's not a selective school or grammar school or private school or anything like that.
Sure.
It's comprehensive with all the kind of range and diversity we have that goes along with that. And I have this wonderful poetry club. I have 20 poets who come after school on a Friday, voluntarily after school on a Friday.
Right.
And what I think is really interesting about that is people assume I'm going to get the academic high flyers. I'm going to get the students from our sort of slightly more affluent families. And I have a few of those, but it is the complete range of students that I have in those in that group of 20. I've got students from all sorts of backgrounds, students who speak English as a second language, students who've got really some quite significant challenges, mental health challenges or special needs, special educational needs and that sort of thing. And they absolutely love it. They're beautiful writers. And you know what I think it is? I think it's that poetry hasn't got the rules. I think I'm not there as an English teacher saying, write in paragraphs and put a semicolon there. I'm saying, read this. How do you feel about this? Now let's write something ourselves. And they come out after an hour and they've written something beautiful and they've shared it with each other. And it's the best hour of my week, honestly.
So that explains why poetry appeals in ways that other things don't. Does it explain why, and you may reject this, it's one piece of research, why the children from less affluent backgrounds engage with it more? I prefer even more, because we're not suggesting for a moment that better off kids can't or don't engage with poetry. Why might the poorer children from less affluent backgrounds engage with it more than some of their classmates?
Because they can all do it. There's no barriers. I just think it's a great level of poetry. Everyone can do it. Everyone can access it on some level, and everyone can feel what it feels. The music of the language and the way it shortcuts straight to your heart. Yes. And that's classless, and that's ageless, and that's genderless, and it's all.
But that doesn't. I'm being a bit of a pain in the proverbial, but you're a teacher, so you're used to it. That doesn't explain why. That would explain that description would predict an equal spread of enthusiasm, wouldn't it? Because it's classless.
That's what I've got. That's what I've got.
That's what you've got. That's not what this research depicts.
Well, I think it makes a bigger difference to the ones from a less affluent background. If that makes sense. So they all come and they enjoy it. They can all enjoy it. They can all access it. But I think for those students who are perhaps more disadvantaged, and I use that term carefully because of schools, obviously,
I know.
We don't like to label our children, but.
Yes.
So that's what it is that makes more of a difference to them, because that sense of when they've gone away and they've created something just as good as everybody else, that's huge.
Yes, indeed it is.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. But that is what I would expect from a winner of the Hamish Cannon Prize.
Have you just Googled me?
No, I've just used my skills as a literary detective to work out exactly who you are.
I'm a poet. I'm just, but honestly, I've been a teacher much longer than I've been a poet, and it's.
What happened then, Nia? Can I ask you that? When did the need to write poetry kick in, and how? Given that you were already a teacher.
So I'm from a working class background, and I went in and did a career first and foremost that paid my bills. I love teaching. I absolutely love teaching, but I decided to do my MA in creative writing and become a poet, and alongside teaching when I could afford to do so, when I had the time to do that. And it took me until I was in my 40s to do that. And that's the working class background. That is it took me that time to get there because I didn't have those advantages to start with.
Can you think of any way? Can you think of any way in which you might have been more qualified to contribute to this conversation?
Well, I just thought, and I've never rung you. I've listened to you for absolutely years, and I've never felt more qualified to ring you than today.
Have you listened?
I'm so glad you're talking about poetry. I'm so glad you're talking about it.
Have you listened for long enough to know what the highest accolade I can give to a caller is to this program?
Oh gosh.
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you build
Did I just get a Ray Liotta? I don't believe it.
That's almost a poem in itself.
Oh, well, that's.
Can I mention the book? Because if I mention the book, I have to say your full name. And are you comfortable with that? Are you happy?
I'm comfortable with that. I'm absolutely comfortable with
fantastic.
that.
Back Along by Nia Broomhold is published now by Blood Axe, and there it is. So a conversation from someone who is head of English at a comprehensive school and a published poet and runs the poetry club at her school. Ray Liotta's, if you're new to the programme, are reserved for people whose qualifications to contribute to the topic or the conversation that we're currently having are almost beyond belief. And I'm not sure anyone can quibble with Nia's qualifications in this case. Gosh, that was lovely. Thank you. And that idea of possibly even needing it more, the freedom of access to poetry, the lack of rules being part of something that appeals to people more or less according to how constrained they ordinarily feel by rules, and some of the answers to the question that you're providing of why younger people people from less affluent backgrounds might be more profoundly affected by it are really getting me. Roddy wonders whether it could be that the children from less affluent backgrounds have more visceral experiences, generally speaking, so they feel more of a connection to the poetic mindset. I speak as a working class academic, he writes, who loved literature as a child. It's coming up to 12:30. I'll squeeze in one more, shall I? Joanna's in Sunderland. Joanne, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Hi. I'm a primary school teacher. This is my 29th year in teaching.
Gosh.
And I know.
Go on. Thought I was tired.
Yesterday, the whole of our Key Stage 2 in my lovely small but mighty school, we took part in a Guinness Book. And because we put such a high priority on reading for pleasure, including poetry,
yes,
then that's going to give those bairns a higher life chance,
Yes.
It's a proven statistic. The more you read, the more chance you have in life. So I'm not bothered what they read. If it's poetry that tickles them, go for it. If it's like a graphic novel, go for it.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
But I think if poetry is often short and snappy and fun, and that's what hooks the children in. That's what gets them going. And I teach in what's classed as a deprived area. I'm in the northeast.
Yes.
But why should any child have a cap on what they aspire to be? Let them love their learning. Let them enjoy it. And poetry gives the children that. It gives them that enthusiasm, and they think, oh, well, if I can read that, I might be able to read that, and I might be able to read that. I mean, I did The Raven with Year 6 last year, and wow, that knocked their socks off. And it was me less able bairns who got it more than me high flyers.
Was it really?
And yes, it was, yeah.
Because we think that they
think they can't, but they can.
That's the thing. So the lower your possibly self-esteem is, the more delighted you will be by the discovery that this speaks to you.
Completely. completely.
Oh, gosh. That's heartbreaking, isn't it?
But it empowers them.
In a good way. It's beautifully heartbreaking because it's working on them. And now we all start worrying about the ones that haven't got a Joanne or a Nia in their lives at school or at home.
Yeah.
Such a gift to give a kid, isn't it? It must be very, very satisfying, even after 29 years. There must be days there must be days where it feels box fresh when you see the reaction on a little face.
Yeah, because if I didn't say that, that's the time to walk away. Because I love my kids. I love my school. And at the bottom of us, I love this job, because if you don't love it, you can't do it. We're not just in it for the holidays. there's a lot more to being a teacher and to working with little than that.
I will always have the back of teachers in general, but especially teachers like you. And you're right, there is still some lazy rhetoric out there about holidays or whatever other cliche is currently in vogue. Thank you. Oh, wow, crikey. Imagine if every kid in the country had teachers like Nia and Joanne. I suspect we'd be looking at a rather different society already than the one that we currently inhabit. It's 12:33 and Tim Humphrey's here with your headlines. It's 12:36. Well, crikey, we're getting answers galore, aren't we? And goodness me, are they powerful, helpful. Why would children from less affluent backgrounds respond more, engage more with poetry? And what is it that poetry does that other forms of words cannot do? It is a perforated line, I think, the line between poetry and prose. There's some prose that, for me, is lyrical and therefore poetic. But in terms of form, how it looks on the page, there's a distinction to be drawn between poetry and prose. And the impact of one is other from the other. Frankie is in Edinburgh. Frankie, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, funnily enough, I was walking home from school and my mum texted me, because my mum listens to you, and she was like, oh my God, they're talking about poetry and what it means. And I'm an avid poet. I write poetry about my experiences as a young trans person growing up in a world that seems to be constantly against me. Yes. And so she was just like, call in, and if you go through, get off the bus. So,
great advice from your mum. Did you get off the bus, Frankie?
I did get off the bus.
So what does poetry do as a consumer, or indeed as a purveyor of poetry? What does it do that other forms of words cannot do?
Well, poetry for me is a protest, and like I said, it's a way of me conveying my emotions and my feelings and my opinions in a way that you wouldn't, at least the people I've encountered, wouldn't normally expect a protest to do. You know, a lot of the time people hear the word protest and they think of like marches in the streets, or sitting down in front of big, just very physical forms of protests. But the protest I do is showing people both the good and the bad of growing up in a world where your gender is a debate and your authenticity is up to a government that you had no say in, because I can't even vote yet. And while I might not be able to speak on why it seems really like less affluent children are more drawn to it, I know I was drawn to it because it's a way of, without any rules or regulations like stories do. There doesn't need to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. Yeah. It's just a poem.
Well, I'm gonna, well, not force you, but I'm going to encourage you to speculate upon why affluence may have something to do with what you've just described. Why might children from one side of the street be more drawn to that absence of rule and form than children from the other side of the street?
I think a lot of the time, I can't remember if it was the previous caller or the one before that mentioned how less affluent children are, I guess, less able to have fairy tales and once upon a time and stuff like that. And poetry isn't, it was bad and then it was magically good. Poetry is very much real. And I think a lot of the less affluent children could be drawn to it because it is more realistic. There's a lot of the time, there is no fairy godmother. There is no magic spell. It's just reality, and poetry takes that reality and shows it in a way that is a lot. It's not very, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not sugar coated. you get poets, even the old poets like Byron and Wordsworth and stuff like that, they were very vocal about the injustices in society, and they did that by using poetry. And I think the less affluent children are drawn to it because it's a way of expressing yourself that doesn't need to be the happily ever after.
Yeah.
It can be violent. It can be gruesome. You can have like swear words and stuff in it, and it's just and they can express themselves through it without feeling the need to not dumb down, but lessen the reality and the harshness of their experiences.
Yes. Well, wow, what an answer. Have you always had poetry in your life, or can you remember a moment of introduction?
Yes. So in S1, I had an English teacher, and she was the one who introduced me to poetry, specifically spoken word.
Yes.
And through her, I wrote my first few poems, and she unfortunately left my school.
Right.
But
not because of your poems, I hope.
I would hope not. And she left my school, but I continued to write. And as I grew older and I grew more aware of my place in the world and what the world was like, I wrote more and more. And as I experienced more things and came to terms with my gender and my sexuality, I wrote more and more and more poems. And now I go to open mics. There's a fantastic open mic every month in Edinburgh that I went to last night. And it's not always been a part of my life, but once it was in my life, it was incredibly hard to ignore. And it's been such a vital way for me to deal with my experiences of transphobes and homophobes and being bullied at school and stuff like that.
Well, that almost answers my last question, which is because none of us ever quite know. I think it's a Robert Frost poem, isn't it? The one about the path not taken. But if you hadn't discovered poetry, how might your life today be different?
I think I would feel a lot less able to express myself.
Yeah.
I know I already said that, but I would feel a lot more obliged to talk about it in a very stern way. This is what happened, and this is why I don't like it. And I feel like I would be a lot less creative, because for me, poetry is how I utilize my creativity. I'm a horrible artist, and I'm not very good at creating music and stuff like that. And so I use poetry, and I think without that, I would be a lot more down, and I would be a lot more out of touch with my feelings and how I respond to the woes.
And that's one of the most
society.
frustrating things of all, the feeling that you can't articulate what you feel is at the heart of all manner of societal problems, not just personal problems. Can I ask your mum's name? I think we should give your mum a shout, shouldn't we?
Yes, my mum is called Helen, and she's listening in the other room right now, and she's probably grinning very, very widely.
Well, Frankie, she's not the only one. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Yeah, you too.
You take care, and well done for getting off that bus. It's just gone 12:44. Simon is in Chiswick. Actually, Brentford is now God's own country, but Chiswick's still all right. Simon, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just think, I think the last caller covered a lot of the things I wanted to say, but the thing about language is that it requires rules to work, and we're mostly sort of enslaved by those rules, which is why so many of us speak in cliches and don't think about the language that we use, whereas poetry, although there's a blurring between prose and poetry, as people have been saying, but poetry offers the opportunity to try and go outside those rules, either through the use of language or, more importantly, in terms of opening up ideas that haven't been said. Or protest was the word your last caller called, and I think that really does sum it up. It's both protest against the actual form of language, and the things that are taken for granted by the culture that you grew up in.
So it's almost as if it unlocks something. So the world of words feels like it has fences.
Yeah.
And then when you get poetry, it's like you've found a hole in the fence almost.
That's exactly what it is. It's a portal into an unexplored world, and every culture is locked into its own forms of thinking and language and concepts. And poetry is the sort of the thread that you can pull that allows you to just, for a moment, perhaps see other possibilities that you wouldn't otherwise have thought of.
This is quite an odd hour of radio, actually, given that I've identified one previous caller as a poet, but I think we've met as well, haven't we? We have. I was so briefly at the Chiswick Book Festival where you were talking about your book. And you gave me your speech, How Language Made Us Human, which couldn't be much more pertinent to the conversation that we're having today. Well, I just happened to turn the radio on today and I heard you speaking about it. It was just like, well, I'm afraid I have to call in. Sorry about that. And in terms of quotes on covers, for people keen to get their hands on something pertinent to the conversation we've been having today, Richard Dawkins, Yoko Ono and Steven Pinker are on the cover of Simon's book, Simon Prentice, to give him his full name, and Speech with an exclamation mark, How Language Made Us Human. Do you want to have a crack, while I have you, at the question of why less affluent children might be more engaged with poetry than some of their more affluent classmates? Well, I mean, I think your previous speaker touched on it too, but if there is a sensible answer, possibly it's to do with the lack of opportunity that less affluent people have. So you grab it harder. You grab it harder. I think so. Yes, it's sort of suddenly there is an opportunity there to think differently, to speak differently, to, if you're surrounded by other opportunities, you may not possibly. Yeah, you're spoiled for choice. Drawn to that. Yeah, exactly. In other words, so. And whereas this, as we've established, I think pretty powerfully since 12 o'clock today, this is truly open to everybody. Would you like to tell people a little bit about your book, Simon? Okay, well, it's a pretty far-reaching study of why we have language in the first place and what it did to us. That was what I set out to do. My professional life I spent as an interpreter and translator working with languages, so I kind of see a lot of how we get stuck in our own particular culture and language, and it was an attempt to really talk about how do we have language in the first place, how it's all developed from very simple rules, and then we just get stuck in those, and how we might escape from that trap, really. That's sort of the overall fantastic trajectory of the book. Just a relatively straightforward mission statement. Yeah. Simon, thank you. Simon Prentice, thank you. The book is By My Bed, and as soon as I finish The Golden Mole by Catherine Rundell, that's next on my non-fiction list. Simon Prentice, author of Speech! Exclamation mark. I could be giving out Ray Liotta's like confetti today, but I think that Nia remains the most worthy recipient. But goodness me, there could have been at least three others. It is 12:51. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've got a poem I might end with today, because it's a poem that I think will reach you if, even having listened to today's conversations, you still think poetry doesn't really speak to you. I think I've got the perfect one for that. We will, of course, find out. Before that, this week's Full Disclosure, in which I go into full fanboy mode. In fact, I'm transported back to 1988, which is roughly the year that I first started getting heavily into poetry myself. But it was a rather different experience in Manchester when I was there for the youth theatre. I've told you about this a million times. Graham Park, right? If you know who he is, you know who he is. Superstar DJ, absolutely seminal influence upon rave culture, dance music, you name it. And he is my guest on Full Disclosure this week, a guest that I got more excited about than anyone I can remember in quite a long time. Here's just a little taste of an extraordinary interview, deeply satisfying for me, and I hope for him, in which we veer as ever on Full Disclosure over his entire life. But this is just literally how he became a DJ.
My first ever gig at the garage in Nottingham, because
Well, this happened by accident.
It did, because
your boss bought a club.
Yeah, so Brian Selby, the late Brian Selby, who owned Selected Disc, his office was on the same floor as the singles and second hand. His door was always open. He's always coming out in the kitchen and having a chat. And he came back to the shop from lunch one day. You could tell he had a few pints. And he says, "Guess what I've just bought? I've just bought a nightclub." "What nightclub is that, Brian?" "The Ad Lib Club." but that's a reggae club. Why have you bought that? It's not going to be a reggae club anymore. This weekend, I'm renaming it and relaunching it as the Garage. I want it to be a cool kind of underground club, a bit like the WAG Club in London, that kind of vibe. And Graham, I want you to DJ. I'm not a DJ. Yes, but I like the eclectic stuff you play. I said, but I'm in a band, working in a record shop. But then I didn't want to lose my job at the record shop because, like I said, I was the best situation I could imagine. So I gave it a go. And that first night, it was literally, I just went home and got my records, borrowed some from the shop. And when they said, right, on you go, I had 2 belt-driven Citronic decks and a mixer, worked it out, and just what I did was play a record I liked.
Yeah.
And then as it was fading out, worked out how to start the next one on time. So it wasn't about mixing.
On that night you worked this out? That first night?
Well, as someone who played in bands, played saxophone, I think that helped.
The language of rhythm and music,
exactly.
You were already quite fluent in.
And then as people came upstairs to check out what the ad lib had turned into and heard me playing Cabaret Voltaire, Human League, New Order, Aztec Camera, Joy Division, and disco, soul, funk, and Motown, and just going to on to the next one, and then
were other DJs doing that? Because I'm thinking back to that era when I was a kid, and these would be the first discos that I went to. Didn't one song stop and then the other one started? Usually,
I wasn't really paying attention to the DJs.
No,
to be honest,
well, that's the point, isn't it? Because you're not trying to second guess, because you're not a purist and you're not a snob.
No,
and you're not that fussed about what anybody else is doing. You're a proper enthusiast, and therefore your confidence in what other people are going to like is coming from your confidence or your knowledge of what you like.
Yeah, well, you say confidence, but I still
not even confidence.
I just stick to my lane. I'm aware of what others are doing because you have to be, but I don't get bothered about it. So a lot of my peers getting a right flap about this new breed of young DJ who's all over social media, who's all dancing and showing off, and they're more obsessed with the tech and the effects than the music. I'm like, why are you? I don't even bother about it.
Tide comes in, the tide goes out again, doesn't
12 years ago with EDM, David Guetta becoming popular, Paris Hilton, a lot of my peers getting really angry about it. I'm like, why? Just stick to your own lane, concentrate on your own game. And that's what I've always done.
Graham Park, guest on this week's Full Disclosure. And full disclosure, you don't have to like the guest. Well, not like. You don't have to be as enthusiastic about the guest as I am. What I'm saying is, even if you don't think dance music is for you, life stories are always fascinating. Everyone on Full Disclosure is a wonderful story. Sheila sent me a lovely clip of Ethan Hawke talking about poetry, art is sustenance, if you want to find it, on YouTube. And it is back to the poetry conversation that we return now with Catherine in Southgate. Catherine, what would you like to say?
Hi. So I think everything that your callers have been saying is fantastic, and I think especially for me, I found that poetry is a lifeline. I was diagnosed quite young with a few learning difficulties, and I got told I'd never be able to read and write.
Blimey.
And so it was my pops, my grandpa, who actually first taught me a 16th century poem called "The North Wind Doth Blow." And he just
by memory, by rote.
Yeah. And he kept drilling it into me. Any other kind of Irish poem that he knew, because he was like, from his childhood, poetry was said out in the fields when you were working. You didn't learn it in the classroom. You learned it as a way to pass the day, to describe the weather.
Oh, well, that leads us back to the other half of the question today a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's like you said, education and poetry can be seen as something that's upper class, or something that's perhaps unattainable for working class children. But actually, the roots of poetry come from the masses who used poetry to describe their feelings. And then I think, especially when I then got to school, for me, the passion I had for it was enough to let one of my teachers really let me flourish, because I was really told that, against studying English.
And I think what we take away from the whole hour is that it's the most democratic of all forms of literature. And your reading and writing now is a huge part of your life, despite being told that it wouldn't happen. Catherine, I'm only moving on. I'd love to talk to you for a tiny bit longer, but I read a poem out on the programme yesterday, by not by coincidence. It was National Blooming Poetry Day. But the bloke who wrote it is on the line. It's been a mad hour, hasn't it, for sort of planets aligning and moments of serendipity. Chris Parker, what made you pick up the phone?
I heard that you were talking about poetry, James, and I heard also yesterday afternoon that you'd read out my poem, Summer Clouds, at the end of the programme, so thank you very much for that.
It was your cousin, that drew it to my attention, I think, your cousin Alan.
Yes, who you've spoken to before, I know, as well. So I wanted to give you a call because obviously I'm a writer and a published poet, and I've been an educator for over 40 years, starting out in inner city comprehensives and ending up in universities.
So what does a poem do that other forms of words cannot?
Well, you mentioned, first of all, that it looks different on the page to prose because it creates space on a page, and it has a shape that's different. And what poetry does, I believe, through that space, we can't move unless there's space.
Yeah. Yeah.
So space invites movement. So we think of that as physiological movement, but actually emotional, psychological, cognitive movement. We need a sense of space. And poetry provides that. It's not just the space on the page, it's the space, if you like, between the words, because poems inevitably are stripped down.
Yes.
You don't want to overwrite a poem. One word is one word too many. The poem is damaged. So what I think a poem does is it invites a type of movement which my area of study as an educator was communication and influence. And from a communication point of view, we'd call this type of movement a transderivational search, which simply means we go inwards to find meaning for ourselves. And a poem encourages to go inwards to find meaning for ourselves. It's not about is it right or wrong. It's my own reaction to it.
Good grief.
And of course, some poems don't appeal to me, and some do. If I read a novel and I don't like the character or the plot or the type of novel, that novel is no use to me. If I have a collection of poetry, there will be some
you can flick through finding
that invite me to move into the space. And that searching for inner meaning is often thoughtless.
Yes.
It's like when you fall in love, it's thoughtless. When you stand on a beach and see a beautiful sunset, you feel it, you go inwards as you react to the outwardness of what's around you, and you are thoughtless. And you don't need to be academically brilliant to go inwards and be thoughtless and wonder and be amazed and consider about the beauty and the wonder and the amazement of nature and humanity.
And that
crosses boundaries.
And that is what John Keats was talking about when he wrote, "Oh, for a life of sensation rather than of thought."
Absolutely.
Mate, you're a star. I'm out of time. Seriously, I'm bang out of time. What is your most recent publication, Chris?
My most recent publication is actually a novel. It's called Protector, published by Chiselbury Publishing.
Fantastic stuff. What an hour. What a beautiful hour. Thank you so much to everybody who helped that reach parts that I told you, ideally, hopefully, other radio phoners presented by me have never reached.
Can we just keep doing it? Can we just keep talking about poetry for 3 hours?
Have you got a poem?
Do you have I do have a favourite.
I've got one that I wanted to do because I think it speaks to people who might think that poetry isn't for them. It's by Wendy Cope. I can do this one from memory,
go on.
but I need to I'll put it in front of me because I always get the last line wrong. Some men never think of it. You did. You'd come along and say you'd nearly brought me flowers, but something had gone wrong. The shop was closed, or you had doubts, the sort that minds like ours dream up incessantly. You thought I might not want your flowers. It made me smile and hug you then. Now I can only smile. But look, the flowers you nearly brought have lasted all this while.
That's beautiful.
Isn't that nice?
Yeah. My favourite is one by Seamus Heaney called When All the Others Were Away at Mass. And it's about how moments of intimacy can happen in really ordinary things. And in that poem, it's him and his mum peeling potatoes. And it's such a lovely poem.
It's all there.
Yeah.
I won't. I'll skip the usual introduction and hand straight over to Shirley.
I just want to keep talking about poetry now. You've ruined me for the day. You've ruined me for the day.
Sorry.